Lord Chesterfield said, "We are more than half what we are by imitation. The great point is to choose good models and to study them with care. We're more than half what we are by imitation." And 300-some years ago, René Descartes, the French scientist and philosopher, said, "The chief cause of human errors is to be found in the prejudices picked up in childhood." And the modern philosopher, George Santa Anna, wrote, "Children insensibly accept all the suggestions of sense and language. Belief then settles down in sullenness and apathy to a narrow circle of vague assumptions, to none of which the mind need have any deep affinity, none of which it need really understand, but which nevertheless it clings to for lack of other footing. The philosophy of the common man is an old wife that gives him no pleasure, yet he cannot live without her, and he resents any aspersions that strangers may cast on her character." People are not naturally skeptics, wondering if a single one of their beliefs can be reasonably preserved. They are dogmatists, angrily confident of maintaining them all. All of this goes to point up the importance of deliberately choosing models we feel are worthy of emulation, and just as deliberately rejecting those which have not proved by the conduct of their own lives that they are worthy of our patterning our lives after. The greatest thing that can happen to a person is to find someone who represents what he himself wants very much to become, a fine model after whom he can pattern his conduct and attitudes. Whenever such a person is faced with a tricky decision, he can ask himself, "What would so-and-so do faced with this situation?" The answer is almost always clear. We have a way of knowing perfectly well what others, whom we know and admire, would do in a given circumstance, or at least we think we do, and it makes our decisions just that much easier, and at the same time tends to keep us on the right track. Going back to the Santa Anna quotation, he said, "People are not naturally skeptics, wondering if a single one of their beliefs can be reasonably preserved. They are dogmatists, angrily confident of maintaining them all." We should be skeptics with regard to our beliefs unless we have been privately convinced that they are true and worth having. I like the statement of Nietzsche when he said, "The idea is not to have the courage of our convictions. It's to have the courage to challenge our convictions." Another thing that seems to frighten people is the idea that they might be thought to be inconsistent. We should be inconsistent and change as we grow toward maturity and fulfillment. There's nothing wrong in changing our minds. As Emerson put it, a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines. With consistency, a great soul has simply nothing to do. He may as well concern himself with his shadow on the wall. Speak what you think now, and tomorrow speak what tomorrow thinks, though it contradict everything you said today. As Chesterfield said, the great point is to choose good models and to study them with care. Pythagoras was misunderstood, and Socrates, and Jesus, and Luther, and Copernicus, and Galileo, and Newton, and every pure and wise spirit that ever took flesh. To be great is to be misunderstood. Living these days tends to become so complex that we have a way of forgetting what's important, and from time to time it's an excellent idea to return to the basics. Go over the ground rules and make sure we've still got them fixed in our minds. I recently had occasion to do some motivational work with many thousands of employees of one of the country's largest business firms. I found there was a good deal of confusion among the younger people, especially regarding what it takes to succeed. It seems that while most people have no trouble at all understanding cause and effect as it works on bodies in a physics class, they seldom make the connection between this same law and themselves. The law of cause and effect can be restated as it applies to people, but it works much the same way all the same. Every act we perform during our waking lives is a cause, and it will have a corresponding effect. By controlling the acts we perform, we can thus control what will happen to us. Barring a calamity of some sort, which is beyond the area of our personal control, we can, by controlling our thoughts and acts, control our lives. Now, we found that this came as news to a surprising number of young people, as did other information relating to the same law of cause and effect. In restating this law as it applies to successful living, we might say, our rewards in life will always be in exact proportion to our service. For example, you can tell what a business firm is doing for the community by observing what the community is doing for the business firm. If the firm wants a larger slice of community rewards, more sales and profits, let's say, why, then it must come up with more service. Again, cause and effect. If any given person wants more in the way of rewards, psychic or tangible or both, he too must find ways of being of greater service. The trouble with so many is that they tend to forget this rule, if indeed they ever really understood it, get themselves into ruts of habit, and operate on minimums. This simply guarantees that they'll receive minimum returns. You'll even hear such people say, "I do no more than I have to. Well, I'm not going to do any more than I'm paid to do." Well, these are people who have forgotten, who have never learned the first rule of successful living. They don't understand that they're controlling their own returns. By performing at minimum standards, they're keeping themselves at the bottom of the pile. Standing in the biggest gold mine on earth, they insist upon using a teaspoon instead of grabbing a snow shovel. If a person would form the habit of asking himself every morning while he's taking a shower and getting ready for work, "How can I increase my service today?" And if he'd then come up with an idea or two, he'd soon find himself at or near the top of the pile. He would find himself receiving all sorts of interesting benefits on and off the job. It's been said that none of us is smart enough to remember everything he knows. Most of us know this simple rule that works like magic in our lives, but we tend to forget it. It's been said that we need reminding as much as we need educating, and from time to time we need to return to the old basic rules. They give meaning and stability in what can otherwise seem like a confusing world. Back when John W. Gardner was president of the Carnegie Corporation, and before he became secretary of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, he wrote a piece for Harper's Magazine on how to prevent organizational dry rot. It was so good that I clipped it and tucked it away, and here in a much abbreviated form are some of John W. Gardner's rules for keeping an organization young and vital. 1. The organization must have an effective program for the recruitment and development of talent. People are the ultimate source of renewal. The shortage of able, highly trained, highly motivated men and women will be a permanent feature of our kind of society, and every organization that wants its share of the short supply is going to have to get out and fight for it. 2. The organization must be a hospitable environment for the individual. Organizations that have killed the spark of individuality in their members will have greatly diminished their capacity for change. 3. The organization must have built-in provisions for self-criticism, an atmosphere in which uncomfortable questions can be asked. The Turks have a proverb that says, "The man who tells the truth should have one foot in the stirrup." This should not be true of the vital organization. 4. Fluidity of internal structure. There have to be departments and divisions, but jurisdictional boundaries tend to get set in concrete. Pretty soon, no solution to a problem is seriously considered if there's any danger that it will threaten jurisdictional lines. 5. An adequate system of communication. Easy, effective communication. 6. The organization must have some means of combating the process by which men and women become prisoners of their procedures. The rule book grows fatter as the ideas grow fewer. Some years ago, a wholesale firm noted that some of its small shopkeeper customers were losing money because of antiquated merchandising methods. The firm decided that it would be good business to assist the shopkeepers in bringing their methods up to date, but soon discovered that many had no desire to modernize or bring them up to date. They just loved the old money-losing, inefficient ways. 7. The organization capable of continuous renewal will have found some means of combating the vested interests that grow up in every human institution. The lowest employees have their vested interests, every foreman has his, and every department head has his. Every change threatens someone's privileges, someone's authority, someone's status. 8. The organization capable of continuous renewal is interested in what it is going to become and not what it has been. 9. An organization runs on motivation, on conviction, on morale. People have to believe that it really makes a difference whether they do well or badly. They have to care. They have to believe that their efforts as individuals will mean something for the whole organization and will be recognized by the whole organization. Change is always risky, usually uncomfortable, also painful. It isn't accomplished by apathetic men and women. The future of a country or an organization of any kind depends on its capacity for self-renewal, and that in turn depends on the vitality of the organization and individuals that make it up. Here's a little exercise in imagination for you. Let's say you were shipwrecked and found yourself in a small boat or on a small island with a handful of other survivors. How long do you think you would all get along well together? How long would it be before different personalities would begin to chafe and wear thin? Well, a family is in many ways like a small group marooned. The members of the family are stuck with each other. Every morning, every night, and on weekends, the little group must get together and live together. No two of the members are alike. Each has a completely different personality, different likes and dislikes. Each has problems which he or she considers to be important. Each sees the world and life from his own unique viewpoint and interests. Yet they must live close together, in the most intimate of relationships, for years, year after year after year. And this can give you an idea why the happy, loving family is about as rare as 25-carat diamonds. It's also why, in even the best managed and usually happy homes, there are times when visiting these homes is like jumping into a river full of piranhas. Someone reached the breaking point, when someone else goes a little too far, and suddenly war is declared. It's believed that much of the discord in the average household could be avoided if more people realized that they're in this lifeboat or small island predicament. That is, if they understood a little better that human beings, any and all human beings, have trouble getting along when they're jammed into close quarters for an extended period of time. The man and his wife and the kids, who are old enough to be reached with this idea, need to understand that the problem does not necessarily lie with Charlie or Joan or little Willie or whatever their names are. They need to understand that the same problem would exist no matter who on earth they happen to live with. Everyone has faults, moods. Changing husbands or wives and raising new kids is nothing more than changing one set of problems for another. A friend of mine was married 6 times in his search, I suppose, for the one woman that he could live with amicably for an extended period. The only thing this achieved was to keep him broke paying alimony and making settlements. I think he finally came to the realization that there is not a woman on earth he could live with in a constant state of bliss. He, of course, had no intention of changing, and the same problem that brought about the divorces with numbers 1 and 2 brought about divorces numbers 3 through 6. I think the lifeboat analogy is particularly apt, because a home is, in many respects, like a lifeboat. It's the way to life and survival, but the problems are built in and should be discussed so that every member of the family makes a constant, conscious effort to contribute to the well-being and success of so precarious a journey. Understanding the problem could keep someone from being pitched overboard. When all the people in a boat are pulling together, each one giving of himself for the good of all, the odds are good they'll have a safe journey. Well, how are you doing in the enthusiasm department these days? The saddest days of our lives are those days in which we can find nothing to be enthusiastic about. I think you can say that a person's enthusiasm is in direct proportion to the importance of what it is he's looking forward to. Thus, there are all sorts of degrees of enthusiasm. People tend to be mildly enthusiastic on Fridays simply because it's the last day of the week and they've got a free weekend coming up. People tend to be more enthusiastic about going home after work at night than they are about leaving for work in the morning. But the most fortunate people on earth are those who live most of their lives in a state of energizing enthusiasm. And you know what the key to enthusiasm is? Well, there are 2 keys, really. One comes from learning, the other comes from accomplishment. Learning new things tends to keep our enthusiasm high. Perhaps this explains the natural enthusiasm of children. If you've paid much attention to children, you've noticed that they're naturally enthusiastic and they're naturally happy. The reason adults tend to lose a lot of their enthusiasm for living is that they usually stop learning. As soon as school's over, they take the stand, consciously or unconsciously, that they know enough. Any learning they do from that point on, they do passively through the natural passage of time and experience, or, again, passively through the media of newspapers, radio, and television. If new learning comes to them, it does so largely through no efforts, or at least minimal efforts on their part. Learning little that is new or interesting, their lives become repetitious and settle down into well-worn grooves. They see the same people and go through the same motions every day, and gradually or quickly, all or most of the enthusiasm fades from their lives. The second key usually ties in with the first, the second key being accomplishment. It's pretty hard to accomplish something new without first learning something new, even if the accomplishment is limited to improving one's golf game or making furniture in the basement. But we're enthusiastic when we're working on a project we want to complete or master. The key word there is want. It has to be something we want very much to do, as opposed to those duties and projects we must do whether we like them or not. Did you ever get a good look at a dog's face when he's chasing a rabbit? It's the happiest, most alert expression you'll ever see in your life. He's got something wonderfully worthwhile to do, and he's having the time of his life trying to do it. You'd hardly know it was the same dog you saw snoozing and twitching on the back porch before the rabbit came into the picture. He couldn't even keep his eyes open then. It's the same with people. The rabbit may be different for each of us, but it's our job to flesh it out. The word enthusiasm comes from the Greek word entheos, which means the God within. And the happiest, most interesting people are those who have found the secret of maintaining their enthusiasm, that God within. You know, one of the most difficult things to teach, and because of this, the most difficult thing for a person to learn, is the all-powerful force of faith or belief. As the great Dr. Ernest Holmes once put it, and he devoted his life to the teaching of this great truth, here's a power which every person has, but which few people use consciously. One man does not possess this power above another, or to a greater degree. Everyone has it, since everyone lives and has consciousness. The question, then, is not, do we have the power? It is merely, are we using it correctly? Dr. Alexis Carrel, the great Nobel Prize-winning physician, said that when a person discovers the extent of his powers by the conscious and correct use of faith or belief, or whatever you want to call it, he finds that there has been introduced an entirely new set of laws into his experience. New to his experience, yes, but the laws are not new themselves. When a person discovers what the power of belief can mean, how it can revolutionize a life for the better, he is at first astounded until he realizes that his former life was operating on the same principle. The difference is that the person who understands uses this power for good to achieve the things he wants to achieve, while the person who does not understand uses the same power to hold himself back, to limit himself, and to live a sort of half-life, a second-hand life. It would be a great surprise to most people to discover that the very law which now holds them back, holds them in a kind of bondage, is the very same law which could free them if they just used it in a slightly different way. To illustrate this point, Dr. Holmes would quote the poem which goes, "One ship drives east, and another drives west, with the self-same winds that blow. 'Tis the set of the sails and not the gales which tell us the way to go." Now, this makes a good point. With a sailboat, you can go east or west, steer onto the rocks, or bring it gently to anchor in a snug harbor, all with the same wind, blowing in the same direction. It's all up to you and the way you handle the tiller and the sails. And when you're talking about faith and belief, you have to bring in the greatest book ever written, and the greatest teacher of the ages on this subject. And he summed it all up when he said, "Go thy way, and as thou hast believed, so be it done unto thee." This is the sentence or the glory of every human being. As he believes, so is it done unto him. But the power of belief is with him. It's his sailboat, and it's his hand on the tiller, whether he knows it or not, or whether he likes it or not. And the same force that leads one person into fulfillment and happiness and abundance keeps another person plodding on the fringes, looking, as Hausmann put it, fearful and afraid at a world he did not make. The pity of it is that the world could be his if he only understood that most difficult thing, to teach or to learn, that we become what we think about, that as we believe, so is it done unto us. It's good for all of us to remember that bit about the sailboat. If the direction we're heading is not to our liking, maybe we need to remind ourselves that we're the ones who are steering the boat. Would you say that you're a wave maker? That is, do you make waves in your pond? Are you a boat rocker, or do you tend to shy away from rocking the boat? Supervisory Management had something interesting on this, written by Mr. R.S. Reynolds, Jr. He said a business managed by men who are playing it safe cannot thrive. Take a look at the top 100 companies today. They're the doers, the innovators, and they reached the top because they refused to play it safe. Now, it's common knowledge that some people resist change because it threatens their status and security. They're afraid that innovation will rock the boat. But you don't get superior performance from people who are afraid the boat will rock. You get it from ones who want to row, or at least help row the boat. Now, what are the earmarks of the manager who helps mold the company instead of being molded by his own routine, his fear of change? He makes things happen. He's an innovator. He can be judged by the men who work for him. By delegating his work to good men, he helps them grow in their jobs, frees himself for further innovation. He's a skilled organizer. He's more a generalist than was yesterday's manager. He understands all phases of the company's operations, is quick to recognize new problems and opportunities. So said Mr. Reynolds. Each of us should, from time to time, rate himself on his skills as a manager. Everyone's a manager of something. To begin with, each of us is the manager of his own life. A husband and wife have substantial responsibilities as management people, especially where the children are involved, and their own well-being. But getting back to business management, I'm fortunate in that I regularly associate with top management people of some of the biggest and best companies in the world. They're clients of ours. And the one thing they have in common is that they're always up to something. There's always something exciting in the wind. The minute the boat starts to settle down, about 50 people grab the gunnels and start shaking it for all they're worth. They make mistakes from time to time. They're bound to. But they also make a lot of right decisions, too. Decisions that keep their companies moving up and ahead of the pack. In the executive offices of these companies, you're struck by a feeling of youth, even though the original founders may have been dead for decades. The fact that last year's sales ran into the billions of dollars doesn't mean a thing. That was last year. Yes, as Mr. Reynolds said, take a look at the top 100 companies today. They're the doers, the innovators, and they reached the top because they did not play it safe. The same thing will apply to the top 100 business firms in any big city in the country. They're managed by people who know that the smoothest water is the shallowest, and that's where the rocks lurk. How are you doing in the wave-making department? You never get promoted when no one else knows your current job. The best basis for being advanced is to organize yourself out of every job you're put into. Most people are advanced because they're pushed up by the people underneath, rather than pulled up from above. Here are a few reminders for those of us who expect to survive and prosper in the world of business, and advice for the person who plans to go into business for himself or rise in the ranks of the modern corporation. This first bit of advice was written by the well-known publisher and speaker Red Motley, who is a good friend of mine. He said, "Accept the fact that people do not need what you have to sell them. You may think they do, but they don't. Accept the fact that needs are not important, but that wants are all important. Millions of people ought to have what you're selling, but until you make them want what you have, they'll never buy it. Remember this. If a man is made to want something badly enough, nothing in the world can stand in the way of his getting it. Nothing happens until somebody sells something. The salesman, the want creator, is a very important person." That's right, Red. It's good. Sometimes we forget who the salesman is. He's the man with the briefcase getting on the plane, and he's the man knocking at your door. But he's also the man behind the door marked President, and he's the man burning the midnight oil at the advertising agency who knows the truth of Leo Burnett's comment that any fool can write a bad ad, but it takes a real genius to keep his hands off a good one. It was also Leo Burnett who said, after all the meetings are over, the phones have stopped ringing and the vocalizing has died down, somebody finally has to get out an ad, often after hours. Somebody has to stare at a blank piece of paper. This is probably the very height of lonesomeness. Out of the recesses of his mind must come words which interest, words which persuade, words which inspire, words which sell, magic words. I regard him as the man of the hour in our business today. And Mr. Charles Brower, president of BBD&O, wrote, when you try to formalize or socialize creative activity, the only sure result is commercial constipation. The good ideas are all hammered out in agony by individuals, not spewed out by groups. I'd like to add that this should be of particular interest to that breed of modern executive who carries the delegation of authority to the point where he even expects all good ideas to come from minds other than his own. And quoting Mr. Brower again, he said, "There's no such thing as soft sell and hard sell. There's only smart sell and stupid sell." And since Mr. Brower has the floor, if you would succeed today, remember that this is the great era of the goof-off, the age of the half-done job. The land from coast to coast has been enjoying a stampede away from responsibility. It's populated with laundrymen who won't iron shirts, or when they do, they break your buttons, with waiters who won't serve, with carpenters who will come around someday maybe, with executives whose minds are on the golf course, with teachers who demand a single salary scale so that achievement cannot be rewarded, with students who take cinch courses. In the end, the formula remains the same today. Excellence in every department of your business, excellence renewed every day. We all know really what it takes to succeed in the world of today, but it's good to be reminded once in a while to reaffirm our belief and start looking in corners for signs of the dust of complacency. Here's something you might find interesting. It's called The 4 Marks of an Educated Person. See if you fit. He speaks and writes clearly and precisely, no matter how much information he may have stored away in his brain. A man is not educated until he's able to use his mother tongue with grace, precision, and clarity. He has a set of values and the courage to defend them. Knowledge and experience have given him the capacity to discriminate not only between right and wrong, but also between the trivial and the significant, between that which is cheap and that which has integrity. He tries to understand his society and how it differs from others. He views these differences with compassion and respect, where the uneducated man sees them as evidence of his own superiority, regarding the customs of others with condescension or contempt. He looks squarely at the world and its problems, and always with hope. He neither rejects nor fears the complexities and the dangers of modern life, but accepts as his responsibility the task of making order out of complexity, opportunity out of danger. It's good, isn't it? How did you do? Did you qualify on all 4 counts? All 4 qualifications are well within the realm of achievement for anyone. To speak and write clearly and precisely, to have a set of values and the courage to defend them, to try and understand our society and how it differs from others, and to look squarely at the world and its problems, and always with hope. The 4 marks of an educated person. They appeared in the Rotarian some time back and were written by Grayson Kirk. And Dunn's Review made an interesting survey on executive wives. 60% of the executives surveyed filled out the questionnaire on the condition that they remain anonymous. Their answers indicate definitely that a wife can spell trouble, both for her husband's career and for the fortunes of his corporation. Most criticism boiled down to these 3 common complaints. The first is that she's a shrew who makes her mate unhappy at home, or she puts on the dog with other executives' wives, or she's a dominating type, pushing her husband along faster than his ability warrants. I get letters from this type occasionally. She'll write and say she thinks her husband should be doing better, or going after a better, more challenging job, or getting a raise. My suggestion is always that she let her husband decide what he should or should not do in the job department. If she wants to improve someone, she should start with herself. If she thinks it's so easy to earn more money, she can go out and do it, but she's wise to stay off her husband's back in this regard. Dunn's Review found that the perfect executive wife is well-mannered, gracious, even-tempered, interested in people, sociable, willing to travel, willing to move where her husband's job takes him, patient and sympathetic with her husband's career objective. Now, there are many in the women's lib movement who would object to this very strenuously, but anyway, that's what Dunn's Review found that the perfect executive wife amounts to. Now, should corporations look over the wife before they hire the man? More than 2/3 feel that it is important for top management to meet a man's wife before appointing him to a top position, or vice versa, to meet the woman's husband before she is appointed to a top position. How many times have you heard someone say, perhaps heard yourself say, "Oh, I'm a terrible letter writer. I'm all right until I sit down in front of a sheet of paper and then I just go blank"? Well, that's ridiculous. If you're a good, even a fair conversationalist, you can be a very satisfactory letter writer. Write the letter in exactly the same way and using exactly the same words and subjects that you would if the person to whom you're writing were present and sitting across the table from you and you were talking to him. Now, once this is understood, it then becomes a matter of practice. 2 women who, if they were in each other's company, could talk for several hours about things in which both of them have a great deal of interest, will, when writing to each other, have trouble filling a small sheet of notepaper. They could write wonderfully interesting letters to each other if they would write as they would talk if they were together. Each of them could easily fill 10 pages on both sides and provide her correspondent with a charming and interesting interlude reading the letter. The strange thing is that the thought of writing a letter shifts most people into a totally different gear. They suddenly become formal. People they've known for years, and this is also true of businessmen writing business letters, and whose presence would spark an interesting informal conversation, suddenly become distant strangers who must be addressed and written to in a stiff, cold, formal manner. Here are 5 rules semanticists and psychologists have long been recommending to businessmen whose livelihood can be determined in large measure by their ability to communicate. 1. Avoid words that are too familiar or not familiar enough. Overly familiar words tend to make little or no impression. However, your entire audience can be lost in a jungle of obscure words and phrases. 2. Don't confuse or misuse words. The dictionary is your best friend here, and careful checking can save you unnecessary embarrassment. For example, the word correspondent, spelled with 2 R's, is someone you communicate with. Spelled with 1 R, it's a person involved in a divorce suit. If you're at all in doubt as to the spelling of a word, take a minute to look it up. It's good practice, and you'll often find another good word to add to your vocabulary while you're searching for the one you want to use. In fact, you'll average 5 new words every time you look up a word. 3. Be terse. This is important in business letters, but not at all important in personal letters. 4. Recognize the connotation of a word as well as its denotation. A word's denotation is what it means precisely. Its connotation is what it suggests. To understand the difference, try calling a woman fat instead of plump. 5. Strive for simplicity. The best writing is always simple and easy to read and understand. At every opportunity, use the short, hard, gritty, colorful words that carry a bite and add zest to your correspondence. Practice writing interesting letters. Chances are you owe letters to someone. Why not answer them? And avoid cliches such as, I am fine and hope you are the same. You never said that to a person in your life. Your friend should be kept as carefully cultivated as a garden. One of the best ways to keep your friendships warm and close is to work on your correspondence. In Milton's Paradise Lost, Satan says, the mind, in its own place and in itself, can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. When Satan says this, he does not realize its truth or the ironic fact that his hate-filled mind has indeed made for him a hell of heaven, but cannot make a heaven of hell. And Satan, in this great work by Milton, has lots of company. Let's read that line again. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. No one knows or can even guess at the uncounted millions who are living in a virtual heaven of opportunity in every department of their lives, and yet turn it into a living hell. They have every opportunity to love, and yet they hate. They have every opportunity to trust, and yet they mistrust. Every opportunity to work and give of themselves, yet they hold back in a suspicious dread that they're being cheated. They have every opportunity to share in the wealth of the richest society since the beginning of the world, yet they sit and grumble because it's not given to them for being lazy and ignorant. They're ignorant even though they are surrounded on every side with a free and abundant opportunity to learn to their full capacity. The public libraries in their towns and cities are half empty, waiting in vain for them to enter and learn. The schools and their parents beg them to stay in schools to qualify themselves for a fast-changing world, but they drop out. But it's not just to some of these that the mind turns a possible heaven into a hell. In every walk of life, in every strata of society, you can see the bitter, desolate expressions, the hollow eyes and listless hands of those whose minds have condemned them to the tortures of the damned or a life of endless tedium and ennui. The old Roman Seneca put it this way. He said, a great, a good, and a right mind is a kind of divinity lodged in flesh, and may be the blessing of a slave as well as of a prince. It came from heaven, and to heaven it must return, and it's a kind of heavenly felicity which a pure and virtuous mind enjoys in some degree even on earth. And Chaucer said, my mind to me a kingdom is, such present joys therein I find, that it excels all other bliss that earth affords. Every person's mind is his kingdom, and he, as the reigning monarch, decides what kind of a kingdom it is to be, bleak or bountiful, rich or poor, interesting or dull, happy or unhappy. Milton knew what he was talking about when he had his Satan say in Paradise Lost, the mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. An interesting and happy mind can, as Seneca said, be the blessing of a slave as well as a prince, and the most important moment of our lives is when we understand that we can fashion our minds as we will. What stubbing, plowing, digging, and harrowing is to land, that thinking, reflecting, examining is to the mind. We know the soil is rich. The harvest is up to us. I ran across something in the National Observer I think you'll find interesting. It originally appeared in the Atlantic Monthly and was written by Paul Foley, an advertising executive. Of the, some 96 million American females alive today, from infants to octogenarians, 8 out of 10 at some time in their lives will have worked for a wage. In an average month last year, there were some 23 million women at work. Some 17 million of them are full-time workers. Now, though women are represented in almost every type of employment, from domestic help to the highly paid professions, Most jobs that women hold full-time are in the lower-paid, unskilled, semi-skilled, or what might be called the blue smock categories. Since World War II, the number of women in American industry has increased, but the number of women in jobs or professions requiring higher education, training, or specialized knowledge has not kept pace. Why? Well, because too many young American women of college age shy away from the commitments which are necessary to make the most of themselves as individual human beings. They are exhibiting a growing tendency to avoid a career commitment with its earlier commitment to education and preparation in order to enter early into the marriage lottery. The professions are wide open to American women. They won this right long ago, yet only 3.5% of the American lawyers, for instance, are women. Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman to graduate from an American medical college, became an MD in 1849. More than a century later, only 6% of all students in the medical colleges of this country are women, and the figures remained almost constant for more than 50 years. By contrast, of approximately 350,000 doctors in the Soviet Union, 76% are women. In many European countries, 30 to 35% of all practicing physicians are women. As far back as 1956 in the Soviet Union, 53% of all specialists, persons skilled by reasons of higher education in any field of endeavor, 53% were women. 1/3 of all deputies elected to regional Soviets or councils are women. The plain fact is that in the United States today we have an urgent need for more doctors, more dentists, more technicians, more scholars, more philosophers at all levels. We cannot afford the luxury of wasted human potential. So wrote Mr. Paul Foley. Well, you know, this shows the tremendous opportunities that exist for women in this country today. There's a crying need for more women in the professions. You can be a doctor, a lawyer, or other professional and still get married and raise 10 or 15 children if you want to. A man doesn't give up marriage and a home when he opts for the professions, and a woman doesn't have to either. Anyway, it's something to think about, something to talk over with that young daughter of yours. How about it, little girl? Why don't you give some thought or talk to your school counselor about the possibilities of your becoming a doctor or other professional? We need more women in the professions. I've long held the belief, and perhaps you have too, that every business, no matter what its form or function, should have a purpose beyond that of survival. And this will also apply to the family. Now, naturally, the first responsibility of management, whether it's a small neighborhood restaurant, a corner gas station, or a corporate giant, is to survive and grow. It must earn a profit, not just to satisfy the owner, its stockholders, and board of directors, but so that it can pump needed money into research and development and expansion. It must earn a profit so that it can continue to pay the salaries of its employees and offer jobs to additional people as the company grows. Without survival, there's nothing. But it should also have an additional purpose, a deeper meaning constantly before it, and this should be to upgrade all who are influenced by it. Now, I'm sure there are many who will smile at this sentiment, but there are also many who will not. And the fact is that those who take this idea seriously are the most successful people in this or any other country. They also manage the world's most successful business firms in every segment of the business spectrum. For most businesses, this second purpose is ignored, even if it's known or understood, and this is precisely why the great majority of businesses of all kinds have to be classified as second-rate. They lack the deeper cause that must accompany greatness in anything. In fact, the not uncommon slump or leveling off which comes to so many businesses after a long period of growth is often brought about by the loss of this second cause. For example, a business which begins with a purpose of providing the best product it can in its field may, 10 or 15 years later, be more concerned with shaving costs or increasing profit margins or seeing how many of the widgets it can turn out and forgetting all about quality. Now, this business of shaving costs and increasing profit margins is important in business, but only if it's subordinate to the former, if the business is to really flourish. And many once successful business firms have gone under because they became so involved in markets and competition and price that they lost sight of the company's purpose, its reason for being. There's a saying that people remember quality and are proud of it long after they've forgotten price. And the most successful companies on earth are those that manage to give top quality at a very reasonable price. Our country proved to the world that it could be done. But every businessman must ask himself, or at least should ask himself, how is my customer somehow improved, upgraded, bettered because he uses my product or service? What is my contribution to society beyond that of earning a living? Just as a father and mother should ask themselves, what are we contributing to our children besides food, clothing, school, and shelter? It's this greater purpose that spells the difference between that which is average and that which is great, and none of us can ask the question of ourselves too often. Perhaps more people in business should keep in mind the advice David Ogilvy once gave to a group of advertising copywriters. He said, "The consumer is not a moron. She's your wife." In his book, Child of the Century, Ben Hecht observed, "A wise man knows that he has only one enemy, himself. This is an enemy difficult to ignore and full of cunning. It assails one with doubts and fear. It always seeks to loosen and lead one away from one's goal. It's an enemy never to be forgotten, but constantly outwitted." Something to think about, isn't it? And in my way of thinking, a truer statement has never been written. Each of us has only one enemy, himself. An enemy difficult to ignore and full of cunning. And no one knows this enemy better than the person who must manage his own time, as Ben Hecht, as a writer, had to do, or as does the commissioned salesman or the person trying to break a bad habit or lose weight. Mortimer Feinberg, an industrial psychologist writing for Nation's Business, says that one of the hardest things a man can do is to look at himself objectively, realistically, without self-glorification, deception, or despair. An analysis of yourself can pay rich dividends in a variety of ways. Increased effectiveness and impact on others, better personal relationships, greater personal fulfillment. As Bernard M. Baruch put it, only as you know yourself can your brain serve you as a sharp and efficient tool. Know your own failings and passions and prejudices so that you can separate them from what you see. Getting to know yourself is not simple. Psychologists agree that each of us builds up a strong network of defenses which act to protect us from others and, incidentally, from ourselves. All of us are born into this world helpless and dependent. In order to survive, we need to lean on others. The child growing up learns to turn to mother, not only for the comforts of physical help, but for the more rewarding comfort of approval. As we grow older, we continue the search for approval from the widening circle around us. We want friends not only to like us, but to approve of what we do. And in their approval, we find reassurance of our own worth. So great is the human need for love and approval that we will even deceive ourselves, if necessary, rather than face the fact that we might not deserve it. Undisguised, our behavior might not always merit approval. All of us do things that are inconsiderate, unkind, downright cruel. But rather than face ourselves in an unkindly light, even to our own eyes, we unconsciously will protect our image of ourselves. We rationalize. We say, "Oh, well, I did it because," providing supposedly good and substantial reasons for our behavior. We project, disowning the fault and seeing it as the other fellow's problem. We displace by blaming someone else for our own faults that we can't accept. We compensate by stretching ourselves in one area when we failed in another. Our defenses serve two purposes. First, they represent an attempt to prove to others that we're really fine people and anything we do wrong is done for the right reason. And second, they help us to deceive ourselves. Know your enemy, and you can overcome him. Know yourself. The ancient advice still heads the list. And perhaps you can overcome the only real enemy you have, yourself. I had a call the other day from a young life insurance salesman. It was a long-distance call from another state. He told me he was thinking of leaving the life insurance business and going into something else, and he asked me my opinion of a good business for him. I asked him why he was leaving the life insurance business, and he said something to the effect that he just wasn't making any money. I tried to sell it, he said, but nobody wants to buy it. I suggested that maybe his problem is that he's motivated by an attempt to sell rather than by the attempt to help people solve their problems. You know, it's a well-known fact that the average family does not have enough life insurance. This is a problem. In trying to solve this problem, he would probably find himself quite successful selling life insurance. The success of our undertakings depends not so much on the undertakings themselves, but rather by our motive for doing them. It's our motive that makes the difference. One man says, "There ought to be a lot of money in children's books. I'll write one." And then he's disappointed when it's rejected or flops on the market. But Hans Christian Andersen and the Grimm brothers and Lewis Carroll, Mark Twain, and Kipling were motivated to write their great children's stories out of their love for children. And these books and stories will last 1,000 years and earn millions. The greatest novel ever written, War and Peace, by Leo Tolstoy, the greatest companies, the greatest men and women in all walks of life, achieved their greatness out of a desire to solve a problem or fulfill a need or to express something that had to be expressed. Now, this is not to say that these people and companies did not earn a lot of money for what they produced. They did. But the key to their success is to be found in the fact that they were motivated more, at least in the beginning, by what was needed or what they felt they had to do than by any thought of profit. This is the actual secret, the key to profits. The man going into the restaurant business, for example, who does so with a determination to serve the best food in town has 1,000 times more chances of success than the man who goes into the business solely for the purpose of making money. It's a matter of motive, of emphasis. And you'll find this true in every walk of life, every line of business, every job of every type and description. The man who made up his mind to put out the best can of pork and beans in the world did exactly that. He and a lot of bean farmers got rich in the process, but getting rich wasn't his reason for going into business. There's not a single thing on earth wrong about making money. This is why kids mow lawns and why millions of people get up in the morning and go to work. But success and the money that often accompanies it are like happiness. They cannot be sought directly. They are effects. The cause must have a powerful motive behind it. What's your big motive? Both William Shakespeare and Cecil B. DeMille got rich. Separated as they were in time and talent, they were both motivated by the same thing: to produce the very best, to express the very best that was in them. A very good mind belongs to a gentleman named Gilbert Hyatt, Columbia University professor, book critic for Harper's Magazine, radio lecturer, and author. Mr. Hyatt wrote a book many years ago titled Man's Unconquerable Mind, and in one part of this book he wrote, "The human mind is capable of far more work than it has ever done. A normal man uses nearly all his muscles during his mature life, but leaves large areas, perhaps 2/3 of his brain, dormant. Not even the greatest creative thinker has ever complained that his intellect was too weak to serve him, that he found it a dull and clumsy tool, but rather that he was approaching death before he learned all its uses. Then why are there so many ignorant and stupid people in the world? Surely it's because some of them, as individuals, misuse their minds, while others live in societies that discourage thought. Individually, many people throughout the world are simply lazy. The bright, adventurous intelligence which they enjoyed in their youth is allowed to lie virtually unused for the rest of their 70 years, covered over with a sediment of routine, rusted by the constant drip of casual gossip, clogged by meaningless chatter from newspaper and, if you'll pardon the expression, radio and television, employed only on daily problems and the incessant re-examination of personal reminiscences. Often an active mind forces its way out of the cocoon and cries for work, and then its owner gives it false and fruitless work to do. Many a man who unconsciously loathes the boredom of his life will relieve it by thinking, but by thinking about the wrong subjects. He will memorize the first, second, and third horses in all the major races for 40 years, or the batting averages of 2,000 leading players. Many a woman finds her greatest intellectual pleasure in collecting and arranging an immense volume of gossip and genealogy. Who married whom? Who is whose cousin? What are the weaknesses of each particular family? And so forth. And lastly, many an otherwise intelligent man or woman wastes his or her time and intellect by failing to train and use the mind properly, by assembling masses of utterly uncoordinated facts and unverified information, then building on them. Such people become local eccentrics, hollow earth fanatics, amateur metaphysicians. They're not fools, but they have minds and spoil them. David Seabury has written that we must understand that our minds are not us. Our minds are tools that we may pick up and use for whatever task we choose, and just as you wouldn't use a fine steel carving knife to hack at heavy bones, you shouldn't waste the time and blunt the cutting edge of your mind on dulling subjects. Perhaps heredity might put an upper limit on a child's intellectual capacity, but this ceiling is so high that many scientists believe no human has yet even approached it. So here we are with 2/3 or more of our minds going to waste. If we can find more and better ways of using them, we can greatly increase the excitement, the fun, the rewards of living. Strange, unfathomable happiness. The happiness of thinking, of seeking knowledge for its own sake. Everyone's tasted it. It's born in children. It goes to school with them. What happens to it? Here's something else by Gilbert Hyatt. He wrote, thinking, learning, remembering, knowing, imagining, and creating new ideas, preserving and communicating knowledge over distances in time and space. Not only is it wonderful in its compass and variety, it is unique. It makes us human. Consider our lives. All other activities we share with the other inhabitants of the planet. Animals, birds, reptiles, fish, and insects also struggle for power as we do. They organize themselves into social groups. Many build. Some control their environment by ingenious inventions. Some of them, like some of us, collect wealth. They fight. They make love. They play games. Some have powers we shall never possess and can scarcely comprehend. Cunning and skillful they are. Yet collectively they learn little that's new, and individually almost nothing. Their skills are intricate but limited. Their art, though charming, is purely decorative. Their languages consist of a few dozen signs and sounds. Their memory is vivid but restricted. Their curiosity is shallow and temporary, merely the rudiment of that wonder which fills the mind of a human scientist or poet or historian or philosopher. They cannot conceive of learning and knowledge as a limitless activity administered by the power of will. Only human beings really learn and know and remember and think creatively as individuals. Knowledge acquired and extended for its own sake is the specific quality that makes us human. Our species has the hair and lungs of animals, reptilian bones, and fish-like blood. We are close indeed to the beasts. Often we're more cruel. But we're fundamentally different from them in that we can learn almost infinitely and know and recollect. We are Homo sapiens, man the thinker. The life of every individual man and woman is made up of many acts and passions, but it is most clearly and consistently seen as a pattern of learning. We think all the time. Our thoughts and our experiences continually form a mass of material which we accept and try to organize. It is chiefly in the depth and completeness of its organization that we differ from one another. History is the record of struggles for power, is exciting but unrewarding. Dinosaurs tore at one another for ages. Some survived for a while, some died. It's all meaningless. Tribes of human beings have been hunting and rending and enslaving one another for many centuries. It is factual, but is it important? No. Surely our essential history is the story of our learning and thinking. It was by learning that we ceased to be animals and made ourselves into men and women. That was the first stage. Cell by cell and reflex by reflex, the wonderful human brain was formed, and with it our two other human powers, the devices by which, even if the world fell into ruins, we can still rebuild it. Our fantastically intricate speech and our ingenious, adaptable hands. So wrote Gilbert Hyatt, and in reflecting on all of this, it makes you want to ask, but what am I doing with these wondrous gifts? It's said that if you give too much to a child, he will come to take his gifts for granted, as little more than is due. You and I have been given gifts beyond measure or price, and our reaction is usually the same. Someone sent me a very interesting little article about the words we use most. What do you think is the most frequently used word? Well, that's it. It's is. The personal pronoun I is more popular than you. Man outranks woman, but mother has a considerable edge over father. Scholars from the University of Chicago and the University of North Carolina have compiled a list of the 8,000 most frequently used words in the language, and they made this discovery. Regardless of education, most people use only 403 words in more than 80% of their everyday conversation. Now, whether you're a PhD, a ditch digger, a waitress, an office clerk, or a botanist, your basic talking vocabulary is about the same, the research team concluded, and you use only 403 words in more than 80% of your everyday conversation. Now, do you realize what this means? Well, to me it means that you can speak any language with comparative ease by learning only about 400 words. Because despite the fact that there are more than 450,000 words in Webster's Big Dictionary, over 600,000 in the English language, we use the same few over and over again. The word is the most used, followed by the, and, a, and to. In fact, these 5 tiny words, is, the, and, a, and to, provide 1/6 of a person's spoken vocabulary. And think of this, the first 33 words on the list of most used words constitute more than half of a person's everyday speech. Now, here again you can see how easy it should be to learn to get along in a foreign language, if we know which words to learn and how to hang them together. 33 words represent more than half of our daily conversation. And here's an interesting sidelight of this whole thing. It'll give you an idea as to how we generally react to things and ideas. The word no ranks 87th in the list of the most frequently used words. The word yes ranks 366th. In other words, we use the word no more than 4 times as often as we use the word yes. However, the word good ranks 114th, while bad ranks 309th. And to give you an idea of why so few words make up our daily speech, the word hard ranks 144th on the list, but the word difficult ranks 474th. This means we use the word hard when we mean difficult, and it gives us another indication of how really few words you need to know to get along, at least fairly well, in language. There are other hopeful signs. The word love ranks 264th, and the word hate does not appear on the list. On the other hand, war ranks 3051st, and peace does not appear on the list. The word God stands at 511th, and the list of the 10 most often used nouns is interesting. We are most likely to talk of a man, a picture, woman, mother, thing, way, hand, girl, kind, or face, in that order, as the 10 most often used nouns. The 10 most frequently used verbs are look, think, know, go, seem, see, say, get, try, and come. It was also discovered who does the most talking, men or women. The study found that women talk more than men and say much less. They say more in words, but they don't put across as many ideas. Now, that's according to the survey. That isn't my opinion. It's interesting, isn't it? Here are 10 questions calculated to determine how happy and well-adjusted you are. They're questions a psychiatrist or psychologist might ask you. See how you do. 1. Are you happy? That is, do you consider yourself to be a generally happy person? Do you tend to look on the bright side of things, or do you tend to be suspicious and fearful? 2. Do you have a zest for living? Do you look forward to your days with interest and anticipation? 3. Are you socially adjusted? That is, do you get along well with other people? Do you have a good circle of friends and enjoy being with other people? Can you look at most things from the other person's point of view as well as your own? The loss of interest in being with other people, a loss of interest generally, is often the first sign of mental illness. 4. Do you have unity and balance? This is to say, do you have many interests? It's unhealthy to wrap your life around any one thing. Every person needs many supports under his table. He finds interest and challenge in his work and does it well, but he also has many other interests. 5. Can you live with each problem as it arises? Of all the things you worried about last year, how many actually happened? Do you recognize problems as a normal, healthy part of living, and look upon them as challenges to be solved and overcome, or do you try to run and hide from them or let them overwhelm you? 6. Do you have insight into your own conduct? Can you see yourself as others see you and understand why you do the things you do? 7. Do you have a confidential relationship with someone? Everyone needs someone with whom he can let down the barriers and talk out his fears and problems completely, with whom he can be completely candid. 8. Do you have a sense of the ridiculous? Can you laugh at yourself? Laughter's been called the sunshine of the soul. Without it, darkness settles in. Never lose your sense of humor. You can't get ulcers when you're laughing. 9. Are you engaged in satisfying work? The well-adjusted person realizes the importance of work, the right kind of work, the kind of work that uses up his energy in a fulfilling and creative way and leaves him tired but satisfied. And 10, do you know how to worry effectively? Do you understand that lurking in every situation that causes you worry or concern, there is an equivalent benefit to be found? Okay, how'd you do in the well-adjusted department? If you found you could answer yes to every question, you're a happy, creative, productive human being. If you answered no to some of the questions, well, at least you know the areas that need strengthening. Epictetus was a Greek philosopher who lived in the 1st century A.D. Very little is known about him except that he was a slave and that he was lame, which, according to one tradition, was due to tortures inflicted upon him by his master. He was ultimately emancipated and became a teacher of philosophy in Rome. When the Roman emperor banished all philosophers from Italy about 90 A.D., Epictetus moved on but continued his teaching. Like so many other great teachers, he left nothing in writing. For the record of his teaching and utterances, we are indebted to his disciple, the Greek philosopher and historian Arian. Epictetus stressed the importance of cultivating complete independence of external circumstances and learning that if a person is to find happiness, he must find it within himself. Like Emerson, who was to follow centuries later, Epictetus taught the duty of reverencing the voice of reason in the soul. And every time I take him down from my library shelf and start poking around at his sayings, I come away refreshed and invigorated. Take this quotation, for instance. Even as the sun doth not wait for prayers and incantations to rise, but shines forth and is welcomed by all, So thou also wait not for clapping of hands and shouts of praise to do thy duty. Nay, do good of thine own accord, and thou wilt be loved like the sun. And it was Epictetus who first said, Nature hath given men one tongue, but 2 ears, that we may hear from others twice as much as we speak. Here's another one I like. Epictetus said, When we are invited to a banquet, we take what is set before us. And were one to call upon his host to set fish upon the table, or sweet things, he would be deemed absurd. Yet in a word we ask the gods for what they do not give, and that although they have given us so many things. But let me get back to what may have been confusing, that business about reverencing the voice of reason in the soul. Emerson put this many ways. He wrote, Each man has an aptitude born with him. Do your work. I have to say this often, but nature says it oftener. And he also said, self-trust is the first secret of success. The belief that if you are here, the authorities of the universe put you here and for cause. And again, do that which is assigned you, and you cannot hope too much or dare too much. All of this has to do with listening for the voice of reason within each of us, which from time to time clearly outlines the path we should follow. As Emerson also put it, trust thyself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string. Accept the place the divine providence has found for you. Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. At any rate, I enjoyed digging up old Epictetus and our friend Emerson again. I hope you have too. So thou also wait not for clapping of hands, and shouts and praise to do thy duty. Nay, do good of thine own accord, and thou wilt be loved like the sun. Thank you. I went sailing with a friend yesterday in a fast Swedish one-tonner off the coast of southern Florida. The wind was out of the southeast at about 20 knots, and there was a good sea running. It was an exhilarating experience. Everything about it was good. That was on Sunday. Monday morning, as I write these words, I'm just as excited, just as exhilarated as I was yesterday, but for some completely different reasons. Today I'm working on a project I'm trying to put together, an interesting business enterprise. Now, if anything, it's more exciting than sailing. Sailing is my hobby, and I'll never give it up until I have to, but I've learned that I'm happiest, living the fullest, obviously doing what I was meant to do, when I'm making plans for the growth of our organization. And it's good to know that sort of thing about yourself. It means knowing what it takes to turn yourself on, to keep yourself living fully extended right up to the very limits of whatever it is you happen to have to offer. And that's why you can't come up with pat answers for people. The person with whom I went sailing yesterday would have no interest at all in doing what I'm doing today, and I'd be bored stiff doing what he's doing today. The important thing seems to be to find out what it is that makes me excited. There's still time to enjoy sailing or golf or tennis or skiing or flying or whatever happens to interest you as a hobby. An oil magnate friend of mine finds his fun and relaxation playing backgammon. For another person, it's taking the family camping. All good, all fine. But what about when the fun is over, when you come back home and all of a sudden it's Monday morning and the alarm clock is ringing? Now there's the moment of truth for every human being in our society. Now, I'm not saying that the transition from deep, comfortable sleep to the waking state on a Monday morning is going to be a time for celebration. That is a relatively difficult time for any living creature, but after the coffee and the shower comes the moment of truth. What then? Is it interesting? Is it a challenge to the mind and talents? Well, I think it's great when it is, but I don't think it is for most people. I don't think it can be that way all the time for any person. There are times when we're between excitements, when the old excitement is run down and the new one hasn't been fashioned yet. But fashioning excitements is, or seems to be, the one thing a human being can do which keeps things lively and interesting. Sometimes I think I could be perfectly happy for the rest of my life if I could just sail the world forever, sailing from one place to another, the South Pacific, the Western Pacific, New Zealand, Australia, the Indian Ocean, Africa, Europe, on, waking each morning to the sea and the air, looking forward to the next port, and after staying in it a while, looking for the sea again. But I know it wouldn't work that way. After the sea for a while, we long for the land. After too many crowds, we long for solitude. After solitude, we want people. There's a charter boat skipper in the United States Virgin Islands who will tell you as you sit over drinks in the evening that as soon as he can get enough money together, he's going to sell his boat and go back to the farm, where he intends to spend the rest of his life. Now, there must be millions of men who would Imagine that chartering your own sailboat in the Virgin Islands, sailing from one lovely tropical island to another, living on the blue sea in ideal weather year after year, would be about as close to heaven as a human being can make it and still keep vertical with both feet on Mother Earth. But the man with the boat wants the farm. He wants the farm now. After he's back on the farm for a few months or a year or so, he's going to wonder why he sold that sailboat and left the Virgin Islands. He's still in the drifting and looking state, as are millions, looking for the ideal, for utopia. He hasn't found what turns him on and gets him excited, even on a Monday morning. He dreams of an ideal farm, and there isn't such a thing, while perhaps some farmer dreams of sailing the blue waters of the Virgins and the Grenadines. Both are missing the fun and opportunity of the present, while they dream of a vague future for which they are neither qualified nor likely to enjoy for long. The farmer should be enjoying the farm, and the charter boat skipper should be enjoying the Virgin Islands, and the chances are neither one of them is really applying his imagination to what he's doing. Each of them is missing out on the joy of what he's got, while he waits for something that may never happen, and they belong to a big club. Sometime back in the Hillsdale College leadership letter, a good section of it was devoted to the 7 marks of a good man. I found them interesting. Here's the chance for a wife to see how her husband does and a man to quickly assess himself. The 7 marks of a good man. Number 1, a good man has worthy goals. As Seneca put it, when a man doesn't know what harbor he's making for, no wind is the right wind. Goals are vital, and as Donald Laird has pointed out, the greatest airline or railroad is still to be operated. The greatest automobile is still to be designed. The greatest scientific discoveries are still to be made. The greatest of everything is still in the future. So there are plenty of worthy goals to shoot for, in addition to personal goals. A good man has worthy goals. 2, the good man believes that certain values are important. He has values and upholds them. They give order and balance and meaning to his life, and he makes adjustments to life's problems in terms of his values. They're to him a checklist of priorities against which he weighs his decisions. 3, the good man has a satisfying self-image. It's one of relative security, confidence, encouragement, and contentment. An image of self-approval is a healthy thing. Approval by others is important, but in the last analysis, it matters less than self-approval. 4, the good man has inner resources. He has the courage to stand for his convictions. He's more concerned about being right than about personal achievement, advancement, or social popularity. He has no price. He will not sell out. As Roger Babson put it, there is a greater demand for people of character today than at any time in history. Industry, intelligence, imagination, and persistence are great gold mines, and it's still true. 5, the good man works productively. All work and no play is not good. Our bodies and our minds need rest, relaxation, and recreation. Some leisure time is needed by everyone. But work is also essential. It makes an outstanding contribution to good health, both physical and mental. The opportunity to work is a privilege. The ability to work is priceless. 6, the good man serves willingly. If he's at all smart, he knows that his rewards can only be in proportion to his service. But it goes deeper than that. It's like that of the boy who gave blood to save the life of a 12-year-old girl with leukemia. She needed a transfusion, but her rare type of blood made it difficult to locate a donor. Finally, a boy was found who had the same type, and though badly frightened at the prospect, he agreed to give his blood. At the hospital, he stretched out on the table, shut his eyes, and set his teeth, but said nothing. A nurse, concerned by his pale face and frightened appearance, said to him, "Johnny, are you all right?" "Yes," was the reply, but... "Well, but what?" asked the nurse. "When do I die?" responded the boy. For a moment, the nurse was perplexed. Then she said, "You mean that you thought you would have to die to save this little girl?" "Yes," was the response. And number 7, the good man enjoys the success of others. Being successful himself, he enjoys seeing others successful and succeed and helps them where he can. Well, how did you do on the list of the 7 marks of a good human being? Probably a lot better than you at first imagined. I had lunch the other day with the vice president and international sales director of a large, well-known American company. As usual, we got on the subject of communications, and he told me an interesting story. For years, he's been sending a weekly letter to every man in his company's 300-man sales force. Not long ago, he fell to wondering how many of the men actually read this weekly letter. So in the 3rd paragraph of one of the letters, he included this statement: "If you will initial this letter and return it to me, I'll send you $5. It cost his company $25. 5 out of the 300 were reading the letters. Well, it so happens that the weekly letters and the weekly paychecks to the men are mailed on the same day, but in different envelopes. The pay envelope is a different size and color. So one week, they put the paychecks in the envelopes with the weekly letter. The following Monday morning, there was a company-wide crisis. The switchboard was jammed with calls from the stalwarts of the sales force complaining that they had not received their paychecks. When they were told that the checks had been put in the envelope with the weekly letter, there was nothing but unbroken silence on the line, as the men tried to remember where they had thrown away the company newsletter. So much for the effectiveness of in-company communications. In my opinion, there were 3 mistakes made. 1, the letters were undoubtedly poorly and uninterestingly written. The kindest thing a person can do with most in-company letters, house organs, bulletins, and so forth is quietly drop them into the wastebasket. Often as not, the job of writing these letters is given to a person amazingly unqualified to handle them. If you want someone to read your letters, you have to earn his attention and loyalty by making the letters really interesting, with meat and excitement and maybe some good humor in them. Each letter, when it arrives, should be looked forward to with genuine interest. Now, this means that the person in charge of this important job must be qualified and talented. Unless the people are somehow changed and improved by your in-company communications, save your money and stop it. So much for reason number 1. 2, an unbroken weekly barrage of almost anything tends to become tiresome. Find some way of changing what you're doing in this area. Make it bigger one week or smaller or a different color or a different form or with different and interesting pictures. Find some way to fight monotony. And 3, printed communications are never as effective as audio communications. Most people don't like to read. In fact, most people still read at about the 6th grade level, about 200 to 300 words a minute. This doesn't mean they stop their education at the 6th grade. It just means that when we master anything, we tend to leave it right there. We seldom try to improve. Records or tapes are much more effective and will be heard by the entire family. By sharing Dad's company communications, members of the family are drawn more closely together behind him, his problems, goals, and so on. And in this form, again, provided they're interesting and genuinely helpful, the communication will be listened to more than once. Good in-company communications are extremely important. In fact, communications today is the name of the game. And good in-company communications will improve production, sales, morale, and profits. Here's something interesting written by Dorothy Van Doren. She reminds us that when someone asked St. Francis while he was working in his garden what he would do if he were suddenly to learn that he would die at sunset that day, he replied, "I would finish hoeing my garden." That line, she writes, seems to me an answer to all the troubled young people these days who are beginning life in a world that appears to hold no security for them or for anyone young or old. Why should they bother to go to college when the atom war may be just around the corner? Why should a young wife have a baby when the ceiling may collapse on its crib? Why should one paint a picture or write a song or begin a novel? We can't be sure of anything, these young people say, not now or next year or the year after that. Why should we try to make a life for ourselves, they ask. Why should we go to classes or take examinations or get married or look for an apartment or try for a job? Next spring or some spring too frighteningly near, it may all go, the life we've all begun. Our world is in deadly peril. We've lost the promise of tomorrow. Well, St. Francis put the answer in a simple metaphor. Go on hoeing your garden. The task is still there, the house to build, the book to write, the examination to prepare for. If the future looks dark, so did it in every age of the past. And however dark it seems today, however dark it is, we'll meet life better if we fulfill the present to the best of our ability. Today is still ours, along with the obligation to live it to the full. As St. Francis said, we must go on hoeing our garden. What makes that kind of thinking important is that the tomorrow that may never come has a way of coming around anyway. We naturally admire and respect the kind of people who can continue on with what needs to be done in the face of crisis, and those who take a calm look at life and the future. It's like the story of the very old man who was planting a small tree in his garden. The neighbor called over to him and said, "What are you planting that tree for, old man? You'll never live to see it grow up." The old man replied, "You've got to plan on living forever or dying tomorrow." There's something about getting into the swim of things that puts a new face on living. You can wake up in the morning feeling beat and depressed, wondering what's the use, and toying with the idea of just lying there forever. But by forcing yourself out of bed and into the shower and turning to what needs to be done, your attitude begins to change and improve, and before long, well, it all seems worthwhile again. Activity, beginning to do whatever needs to be done, even if you have to force yourself to get started, is the answer to the problems that face us. As someone wrote, do your work. Not just your work and no more, but a little more for the lavishing's sake, that little more that's worth all the rest. And if you doubt as you must, and if you suffer as you must, do your work. Put your heart into it, and the sky will clear. And then from your very doubt and suffering will be born the supreme joy of life. You might want to remember the story about St. Francis and his comment that even if he were to discover that his life would be over at sunset, he'd finish hoeing his garden. Only by sweating freely and breathing hard will you be able to help protect your heart against our number one killer, coronary heart disease. So says Bud Wilkinson in his excellent book, Bud Wilkinson's Guide to Modern Physical Fitness. A President's Commission on Coronary Heart Disease came up with some stunning statistics that diseases of the heart and bloodstream now account for 54.8% of the deaths in the United States from all causes. As many people die of coronaries in this country every year as the total of the people who die from the 5 next most important causes: cancer, accidents, pneumonia and influenza, diabetes, and certain diseases of childhood. Every minute, every hour, every day, someone dies of a coronary in the United States. In 1900, only 20% of the deaths in this country were due to diseases of the heart and blood system. Why has the figure grown to 54.8% in the last few decades? The American Medical Association says that there are growing indications that the threat may be a, quote, disease of prosperity, end of quote. I agree with both statements completely, says Bud Wilkinson. In a very real sense, we're giving ourselves coronaries. We're doing it by trying to create a society that takes the sweat and strain out of living, and we are succeeding to an alarming degree. With any luck, you can go for weeks at a time without drawing a deep breath or raising your pulse rate a beat a minute. You learn to avoid stairs as though they were minefields. You trim your lawn with a power mower that can be converted in the winter to blow snow off your sidewalk. If you're a real status seeker, you have a power mower you can ride. If the hedge needs clipping, you can get an electric appliance to do the job. The examples go on and on endlessly. Electric knives, electric shoe shiners, toothbrushes, even electric cocktail shakers. Sweat is disappearing so rapidly in the United States that the multi-million-dollar deodorant industry may be getting uneasy. Everything has been automated except the human body itself, and there's the rub. We still have bodies that need to be used. We have bodies that have evolved during the centuries of man's presence on Earth into magnificent machines for survival. Putting the matter very simply, the human body is not designed for indolence. It's designed to sweat. The more it labors, the better it gets. In time, say a few 100,000 years, the forces of natural selection may modify the body so that it's suited for leisure, but for now, we're stuck with the old-fashioned model. We're walking around in warriors' bodies. We're equipped to march with Caesar, but there's no place to go but the corner drugstore, and we drive there. Your heart is a pump made of muscle. When it doesn't have enough work to do, it gets softer and less efficient, just as your biceps get soft when you have no loads to lift. The loafer's heart, as it's been called, cannot move as much blood with a single beat as a well-conditioned heart. The more active you are, the less likely a heart attack. Exercise can often reduce the levels of several key factors: high level of blood fats, overweight, high blood pressure, and emotional tension. And here are 9 rules for success that I like. See what you think of. 1, never lose your capacity for enthusiasm. When that's gone, nothing else matters. 2, never lose your capacity for indignation. 3, don't judge people or type them too quickly. Never assume that a person is bad. Assume that at best he's good, and at worst he belongs in that gray area between good and bad. 4, never be impressed by wealth alone or thrown by poverty. The rules for great wealth do not necessarily include becoming a well-rounded, interesting, or even intelligent person. While you will frequently find all these qualities in a wealthy person, the only absolute rules for great wealth are A, make wealth your major goal in life, and B, persist undeviatingly until the goal is reached. As for poverty, there's not a family on earth whose ancestors did not at one time live in poverty. Poverty today does not necessarily indicate poverty tomorrow. 5, if you can't be generous when it's hard, you won't be able to be generous when it's easy. 6, the greatest builder of confidence is the ability to do something, almost anything, well. 7, when that confidence comes, strive for humility. 8, The way to become truly useful is to seek the best that other brains have to offer. What one person can think of, another person can build. Use the brains of others to supplement your own, or you're very probably not going to make it. And then be prepared to give credit when credit is due. As long as no one cares who gets the credit, opportunity is always present. And 9, the greatest tragedies in the world and in personal events stem from misunderstanding. The answer? Communicate. I play golf occasionally with a great person who controls a vast worldwide industrial empire. He told me about a time when working for a large government contract, a government negotiator said something that indicated that my friend was a crook. He was so enraged by the comment that he turned white as a ghost and sat very quiet for a long time before he could get himself under control. Later that night in his hotel room, he received a telephone call from the man who had insulted him. The government man said, "I noticed you seem to get very angry at something I said today, and it's been bothering me ever since. What did I say that rubbed you the wrong way?" Well, when my friend told him, he was amazed. "I didn't mean that the way you took it," he said, and went on to explain. It was simply a matter of crossed communications. And this happens often with all of us, with our families and our business associates. If we'll just keep cool, swallow the angry words, and wait a while, the matter will usually clear up. Anyway, 9 rules for success. Never lose your enthusiasm. Never lose your capacity for indignation. Don't judge people or type them too quickly. Never be impressed by wealth alone or thrown by poverty. If you can't be generous when it's hard, you won't be when it's easy. The greatest builder of confidence is the ability to do something, anything well. When confidence comes, strive for humility. Use the brains of others and give credit when you do, and communicate. How did you score? And incidentally, have you checked your AQ lately? I ran across a most interesting article in Pace magazine some time back devoted to the AQ, which stands for Aspiration Quotient. In short, how are your aspirations? You don't have to concern yourself with this if you're 1, dreaming the possible dream, 2, fighting the beatable foe, or 3, running for mayor of New York City. Your reach should always exceed your present grasp, or you've stopped growing. As Jacqueline Grennan put it, one has to have the kind of security to be insecure if one wants to gamble for the great end. And as John Ciardi once put it, an ulcer, gentlemen, is an unkissed imagination taking its revenge for having been jilted. We find ourselves with a perfectly natural and wonderful daydream that keeps coming back to haunt our idle moments, and instead of going after that daydream, we keep pushing it back until it turns into an ulcer to punish us. Hell hath no fury like an aspiration scorned too long. The test of an aspiration is to ask yourself, is it a worthy thing I'm dreaming of doing or having? Is it good? Will I hurt anyone by bringing this beautiful idea from its dream state into a state of reality? If not, then charge. Fulfill that aspiration and let yourself relax for a while until a new aspiration begins to tug at the coattails of your mind. This is the way to keep things interesting, to make waves, to fight boredom and ennui. If you're without aspirations of any kind, you're probably one of the following. 1, a holy man. 2, enormously rich. 3, a well-adjusted person. Or 4, you're in a rut. Or perhaps you're one of those unfortunate persons who doesn't know that the ground that lies between you and your aspiration can usually be crossed. The trouble with most people when it comes to sprinting for an aspiration seems to lie in their reluctance to haul themselves up out of the old well-worn groove and take off across new exposed ground. But as the old saw has it, you can't very well get to second base and still keep one foot on first. You need the kind of security, inner security, to risk insecurity. If you lack that, well, then I guess you've got to settle for the status quo. But whatever your reactions happen to be, it's good to check one's aspirations from time to time, haul out the old want list, and see how many items you can check off since the last time you looked at it, or if you still want the same things. You've got to be careful. The years tend to do the same thing to our habits that they do to a piece of exposed machinery, which is to rust and fuse them until what were once moving parts don't move anymore. We tend to settle for minimums, except for occasional flashes of bigger and better aspirations, which don't last and which therefore go unrealized. We tend to play it ridiculously safe. Sometimes you get the feeling that people think they're going to live forever. So how's your AQ, your aspiration quotient? Remember what John Ciardi said. An ulcer, gentlemen, is an unkissed imagination taking its revenge for having been jilted. We don't want that to happen, do we? It was reported in the magazine Office Administration that despite all the literature that's been written about motivating employees, there still remain only two basic things which you can do to spur better performance, to make a worker a willing worker. One, you can allow your people to tackle as much and more than they can handle. Most people don't really begin to click until they're under some pressure. Good ideas, a better way to do things, are not the result of a mind working at half speed. Further, people are happier with a full workload. They have more to be happy about, and the day flies by. Two, employees must be given the freedom to make mistakes. A subordinate can win some and lose some. If a wild idea hits the mark, all to the good. If it's a bomb, it's important for you to be solidly behind him. A good manager constantly asks himself this question about each employee. What can I do to make it easier for him to work harder? I agree that those 2 points are important, but I don't agree that they're the only factors involved in helping workers to be willing and conscientious workers. Incidentally, Jacob Jacoby reported in Personnel Journal that the old theory that work music improves employee morale and consequently productivity has little evidence to support it. Recent studies show employees most certainly do enjoy the music, but there is not much to indicate that this enjoyment results in greater productivity. Music, according to a survey of those who listen to it, is more likely to affect quality of work than quantity. Thus, like other morale factors, it may contribute indirectly to productivity by reducing absenteeism, for example. It might also result in less employee turnover. I think music is an excellent idea, if for no other reason that the employees like it. Music makes work more pleasant, and I think it tends to reduce tensions, which can result in poor customer relations and bickering among employees. I have no documentary evidence to support this theory. It's just a personal opinion. But getting back to the 2 main points made earlier, it's true that people don't really begin to click until they're under some pressure. That's the right kind of pressure, the kind that brings out the best in them, not the kind that causes worry or fear. Just come up with a big job to be done and watch how people pitch in and how they enjoy it. We all do. People love to work when the work is recognized, and they're recognized for doing it. And when an employee makes a mistake, and it's an honest mistake, he should get encouragement rather than criticism. People who don't make mistakes aren't trying enough. They're not innovating enough. There are some jobs where you don't want this, like packing parachutes or working on precision parts, but for most jobs, a mistake now and then is a healthy sign. 2 main points in helping people be happier on the job. 1, allow them to tackle as much as they can handle. People are happiest when they're busiest. And 2, give them freedom to make mistakes. You know, visionaries see a day in the future when man will no longer work at all. If that day ever comes, I believe we will have had it. As the Christophers pointed out in one of their excellent little news notes, man is meant to work. Because of his very nature, each person must find a creative, constructive outlet for his talents and energies. The great artist Leonardo da Vinci put it well when he said, "Iron rusts from disuse, stagnant water loses its purity, and in cold weather becomes frozen. Even so does inaction sap the vigors of the mind." We need work with a purpose. To dig holes just to fill them up again is frustrating, but to work toward a goal for others is meaningful. Nothing enriches a person as does work well done, yet people will go to any lengths to avoid the very work that would give meaning to their lives. When Queen Victoria complimented the celebrated pianist Paderewski, she said, "Mr. Paderewski, you are a genius," and he replied, "Perhaps, Your Majesty, but before I was a genius, I was a drudge." The same thought was echoed by Michelangelo when he said, "If people knew how hard I've had to work to gain my mastery, it wouldn't seem wonderful at all." The great inventions of Thomas Edison were the fruit of long, painstaking effort. He said genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. He also said, "I never did anything worth doing by accident, nor did any of my inventions come by accident. They came by work." Work is actually a remedy. A century ago, Thomas Carlyle said work is the grand cure for all the maladies that ever beset mankind. Honest work, which you intend getting done. A survey in London of typists who frequently changed jobs found that they became bored and dissatisfied because they did not have enough work to do. A woman will complain about how overworked she is and enjoy every minute of it. In fact, she'll quit if she doesn't have enough work to do. And the kindest thing parents can do for their children is to teach them to work while they're still young. It's been found that the kids who have definite chores to do around the house, no matter how loud they complain, grow up to be more successful, more productive people. They also make better wives, husbands, and parents. It's important for a youngster to know that work is a part of living, and to get the fun and joy that comes from doing a job well. Thomas Jefferson said, "Do all you can to help boys and girls discover the joy of work. It's while we're young that the habit of industry is formed. If not then, it never is afterwards." The fortune of our lives, therefore, depends on employing well the short period of our youth. You will hear adults say, "Let them play. There'll be plenty of work to do after they're grown." Well, it doesn't work that way. They can still have plenty of time for play and learn to help out a little around the house, too, or hold down a summer job. We don't always like the idea of going to work, but we'd be miserable without it. General Doolittle once said that the prime reason that nations and cultures have died is that the people have become soft and lazy. They've quit work when they've reached the top of the heap. They've endeavored to rest on their laurels. I heard something interesting the other day at lunch. It seems that a friend of mine has a very shrewish wife. For many years he had led a dog's life because of her constant badgering. He would no sooner get home in the evening, but she'd find work for him to do. On the occasion of a recent physical examination, his doctor told him he looked run down and appeared to be suffering from a mild case of exhaustion, depression, and so on. The man explained that his wife was running him ragged. The doctor thought a moment and then asked the man if he'd mind if he had a chat with his wife. The man said, "No, of course not." The doctor called the man's wife and told her that in his opinion her husband was headed straight for a heart attack, and that unless something changed radically, she was going to be a widow in the not-too-distant future. Well, the change at home was immediate and immensely gratifying. The woman obviously saw her husband in a completely new light. Here was the man she loved, or at the very least, here was the man who was bringing home a reliable, negotiable paycheck every week, which made the mortgage payment, bought all kinds of groceries, cars, clothes, and things, suddenly threatened with extinction. Now when he comes home at night, it's as though he's an honored guest. He's treated as though his pockets are stuffed with vials of nitroglycerin, and all is well again in his household. Well, one of the fellows at lunch commented that this was possibly the creative idea of the year. He was going to get his doctor to call his wife and tell her the same story. Someone else said that this is an excellent way to find out what your wife really thinks of you. If she jumps out from behind doors shouting boo, or gives you heavy loads to carry upstairs to the attic, you can come to one conclusion, whereas if she treats you with sudden loving kindness, you can come to another. So it started an interesting conversation, and finally the point was made that if any of us knew that the days of a loved one were numbered, we would treat that person with more love and consideration. The point was then made that we do know that the days of our loved ones are numbered. We just don't know what the number is. So it might be a good idea to think of this once in a while. So much for that. Here's something of interest I found. It's from a speech by James H. Binns, president of the Armstrong Cork Company. He said, if the United States were to equal the accomplishments of Russia, it would have to rip up 14 of every 15 miles of its paved highways, abandon 60% of its steel-making capacity, destroy 2 out of every 3 miles of its railroads, and 7 out of 10 of its homes, junk 19 out of every 20 cars and trucks, and slice away 3/4 of its average paychecks. Something to think about, isn't it? And if the same definition of poverty that some have adopted as a political philosophy were applied to the people of Great Britain, 75% of all the British people would be classified as poor. Herbert Hoover, former President of the United States, once said, "Recently, in my opinion, there's been too much talk about the common man. It's been dinned into us that this is the century of the common man. The idea seems to be that the common man has come into his own at last. Thus we're in danger of developing a cult of the common man, which means a cult of mediocrity. But there is at least one hopeful sign. I've never been able to find out who this common man is. In fact, most people, and especially women, will get mad and fight if you try calling them common. This is hopeful because it shows that most people are holding fast to an essential fact of life. We believe in equal opportunity for all, but we know that this includes the opportunity to rise to leadership, in other words, to be uncommon. Let us remember that the great human advances have not been brought about by mediocre men and women. They were brought about by distinctly uncommon people with vital sparks of leadership. Many of the great leaders were, it is true, of humble origin, but that alone was not their greatness. It's a curious fact that when you get sick, you want an uncommon doctor. If your car breaks down, you want an uncommonly good mechanic. When we get into war, we want very much an uncommon admiral and an uncommon general. I've never met a father and mother who did not want their children to grow up to be uncommon men and women. May it always be so, for the future of the country rests not in mediocrity, but in the constant renewal of leadership in every phase of our national life. It's good, isn't it? You know, the kind, gentle, thoughtful person is the uncommon person. The person who willingly does for others with no thought of what's in it for him is the uncommon person. The person who lets you get your car into a busy traffic lane with a friendly smile and a wave of his hand is the uncommon man. The uncommon person is the person who does not thoughtlessly go along with those by whom he's surrounded. Instead, he thinks, is this right for me? Is this what I really want to do? He never falls into the error of believing that just because his friends and neighbors think and act a certain way, that he must think and act the same way. He knows that, though he may love them, they can be dead wrong, as he knows he can. The uncommon person doesn't confuse differences of opinion with permanent breaks of love or friendship. He may disagree totally with something his son or daughter does. He may throw up his hands in despair from time to time, but he will not let it affect or diminish his love for his children over the long haul. He knows they'll make mistakes just as he has, and that until he's achieved perfection, he should not look for it in others. The uncommon person is a good person to know, and a good person to be. Sinclair Lewis wrote, "That nation is proudest and noblest and most exalted, which has the greatest number of really great human beings." We need more uncommon people. Every person, in establishing the important goals of his life, should ask himself, now, if I establish that as my goal, what will it cost me? Dr. Francis J. Braceland, psychiatrist-in-chief of the country's largest private mental health organization, the Institute of Living in Hartford, Connecticut, stresses that too often goals are established with no thought given to the cost. He says that a considerable proportion of man's illness is a function of his goals, his methods of attaining them, and the conflicts they engender. A man should realize what his actions and goals are costing him. Then, if he chooses, he may even pay for them in pain and disease. Often he'll decide that his values are poor, and that he's been confused, and thence change his direction and his pace. The so-called hard-bitten executive, who has no apparent weaknesses, may be paying for his bravado in some other way, probably physically, or even worse, his wife and children are paying for it. It's a sad thing to see a man make his way to the top and lose his family en route. He can explain to the family that he's really slaving because of them, but they'll often tell him they can do well with fewer material things if they can see more of him. This is particularly important when there are boys in the family. They need a masculine figure to emulate. How should one deal with his family as he climbs his way up the executive ladder? Well, don't put too much stock in trying to make them run like an efficient business organization. Tolstoy had one warning and suggestion. The trouble begins because men sometimes think that you can handle people without love, and you cannot. You can handle things without love. You can carve wood and hammer iron without it, but you cannot deal with people in this fashion. People are like bees. If you handle them roughly, either they will get hurt or you will get hurt. We can be sure that the greatest hope for maintaining equilibrium in the setting of worthwhile goals and in achieving them in the face of any situation rests within ourselves. Persons who are secure with a transcendental system of values and a deep sense of moral duties are possessors of values which no man and no catastrophe can take from them. Under all circumstances, these people will maintain their peace of mind, their position of human dignity, their self-respect, and their sense of duty. It would be worthwhile, the doctor goes on to say, for each of us to pause and take stock of himself. It would even make our jobs more meaningful. We might even find out, like Brutus, that the trouble is not in our stars, but in ourselves. Good advice. Nothing can be achieved without paying the price for it. Whatever you move over here will have a corresponding effect over there. People seem to often forget this. A man without a goal is like a ship without a rudder, but in choosing his goals, he needs to thoughtfully balance the cost. He must be true to himself, but he must also be true to those he has of his own free will involved in his life. The trouble begins because men sometimes think that you can handle people without love, and you cannot. You can handle things without love. You can carve wood and hammer iron without it, but you cannot deal with people in this fashion and succeed. Creative and productive people are not creative and productive for the benefit of others. It's because they're driven by the need to be creative and productive. They'd be creative and productive if they each lived on a deserted island and simply had to stack what he produced in a big pile with no one benefiting or even aware of what he was doing. You'll hear people say that we're happiest when we're serving others, and that's true, but it's not true because of any great altruism on our part. It's true because we experience the joy of producing something. That others benefit from it is fine, but only secondary. It's good to know that others benefit from and enjoy what we produce. There's satisfaction in that, ego satisfaction, and the desire to produce more. If everyone continually rejected our creative or productive efforts, we might become sullen and resentful. We might even stop all efforts for a while. But eventually, we'd begin to produce again in the hope that eventually someone would see the sense of what we're doing. This is the story of the painters who were before their time. Renoir, who was laughed at and rejected not only by the public, but by his own fellow artists. We look at a painting by Renoir today and marvel that anything so fine and beautiful could have ever been an object of scorn. And he painted thousands of paintings. He went right on producing them. When he brought one of his canvases to one of the most eminent Parisian teachers, the expert glanced at the work and said, "You are, I presume, dabbling in paint to amuse yourself." And Renoir replied, "Of course. When it ceases to amuse me, I'll stop painting." Everything he painted delighted him, and he painted everything. Even Manet said to Monet, "Renoir has no talent at all. You who are his friend should tell him kindly to give up painting." A group of artists who were rejected by the establishment of their time formed their own association in self-defense. Do you know who were in that group? They were Degas, Pissarro, Monet, Cézanne, and Renoir. 5 of the greatest artists of all time, all doing what they believed in the face of total rejection. Since we're on the subject of Renoir, in his later life he suffered terribly, from rheumatism, especially in his hands. He lived in constant pain. And when Matisse visited the aging painter, he saw that every stroke was causing renewed pain, and he asked, "Why do you still have to work? Why continue to torture yourself?" And Renoir answered, "The pain passes, but the pleasure, the creation of beauty remains." One day when he was 78 and quite famous and successful, finally he said, "I'm still making progress." And the next day he was dead. This is the mark of a creative, productive person. Still making progress, still learning, still producing as long as he lives, despite pain or problems of all kinds. Not producing for the joy or satisfaction of others, but because he must, because it gives him pleasure and satisfaction. Some time back, there was a very popular play running in New York and Hollywood in which some of the actors appeared in the nude. You probably remember the play. It was called Hair. Groucho Marx was asked if he wanted to see it, and he said he took off his clothes and stood in front of the mirror for 4 minutes and decided not to go. It's the strangest thing about a nude human being. If there were a nude person, adult, in a cage in Times Square, millions would flock to see him. There would be hundreds deep around his cage. Why is that? If it's a naked orangutan or a naked elephant or a naked dugong, people will find it of only passing interest. The zoo is filled with naked creatures and in need of more customers. But let a human being divest himself of his clothes, and the curious and the concupiscent will come from miles around to look. In our big cities there are thousands with telescopes and binoculars scanning windows. You don't find them at the zoo, which is where they ought to be. And there's certainly no mystery to the human form. It's practically identical to that of the great apes. I remember reading a story many years ago about a society on some South Pacific island in which the women covered only their ears. Everyone went about completely naked except for the shells which young women wore over their ears. And when a young couple married and were alone finally in their hut, it was the new husband's right to remove the shells covering his young wife's ears, which act, as you might imagine, he found tremendously stimulating. If a large black box were placed in public view with a sign on it reading, "Do not look inside," well, you'd soon have a problem with the crowd. The people aren't interested in the naked animals in the zoo simply because they're naked all the time. People want to see what is customarily covered, and that, along with our attitudes towards sex, is what produces voyeurism on the part of millions of otherwise relatively normal human beings. People who live in nudist camps are, in my opinion, out of their minds, but at least there's no longer any need for the binoculars or standing in line to see a stage play in which members of the cast appear in the nude. The reason I say people who dwell in nudist camps are out of their minds is simply because it's much more comfortable and physically safer to wear clothes. Clothes for a human being take the place of the animal's coat or thick protective hide. It's much more comfortable to sit on the ground or a chair or a rough board with clothes on than it is without them. Moreover, the human being appears ridiculous without clothing unless love is there. Except for children, who are beautiful in any state, a very small percentage of adult human beings look good in the nude. The rest are ludicrous, and the kindest thing they can do is remain as fully clothed as possible, on the stage or off. Clothing was one of the greatest inventions of all time, and we should take full advantage of it. The next time you're intrigued by a play or motion picture in which the big deal is nudity, do what Groucho Marx did. Stand in front of a mirror with nothing on, and you'll probably decide not to go. On the occasion of his 75th birthday, Mark Van Doren, the American writer, poet, critic, and educator, was interviewed by a reporter for Life magazine, and one of the things he said stuck in my mind. I've saved this. He said, "It takes courage to be happy." And in those 6 words, he said a great deal. Any person can wallow in misery and self-pity. It's easy to rail against the world and its injustices. Easier still to sit down and do nothing, like the famous hound dog with its tail in a crack. But it takes courage to be happy. When he said it takes courage to be happy, he didn't mean happiness today or tomorrow or a week from next Thursday. He meant to be happy as a general, relatively constant way of living. To be a happy person as opposed to a generally unhappy person. And it does take courage of a high order. The world is full, it seems, of the "it's too good to last" or "it's just my kind of luck" people who expect bad luck and rejection as confidently as they expect the sun to rise the next morning. They're people who were given bleak and disappointing starts in life. Tolstoy said man is meant for happiness, and this happiness is in him, in the satisfaction of the daily needs of his existence. And La Rochefoucauld said happiness is in the taste, and not in the things themselves. We're happy from possessing what we like, not from possessing what others like. Rudolph Flesch quotes Jane Austen, a passage that I think is very revealing. She wrote, "No temper could be more cheerful than hers, or possess in a greater degree that sanguine expectation of happiness, which is happiness itself." That sanguine expectation of happiness, which is happiness itself. It is in the expectation of happiness that much of happiness itself is found, and it takes courage to expect happiness. Balzac wrote, "All happiness depends on courage and work." I've had many periods of wretchedness, but with energy and above all with illusions, I pulled through them all. My old favorite, George Santa Anna, said happiness is the only sanction of life. Where happiness fails, existence remains a mad and lamentable experiment. Bertrand Russell put it well when he said, "Contempt for happiness is usually contempt for other people's happiness, and is an elegant disguise for hatred of the human race." The Chinese philosopher Lin Yutang said, "I've always been impressed by the fact that the most studiously avoided subject in Western philosophy is that of happiness." A French philosopher said much the same as did Mark Van Doren. He said, "To live, we must conquer incessantly. We must have the courage to be happy." We've all seen people seriously handicapped in one way or another who are wonderfully cheerful and happy people, and we've wondered how they do it. We've said to ourselves, "I don't think I could be happy if I had his or her affliction." These people are happy because they're courageous, and because they don't like the alternative. Robert Louis Stevenson, a real expert in the happiness department, despite his affliction, said there's no duty we so much underrate as the duty of being happy. One of the enriching blessings of growing older all the time is that it has a way of improving one's sense of humor, or at least it should. The person without a good sense of humor is a person to avoid as though he were a known carrier of the bubonic plague. Horace Walpole once said, "I have never yet seen or heard anything serious that was not ridiculous." Now take your time on that one, but the longer you think about it, the truer and the funnier it becomes. It's worth repeating. I have never yet seen or heard anything serious that was not ridiculous. And Samuel Butler said, "The one serious conviction that a man should have is that nothing is to be taken seriously. It's been said that seriousness is the only refuge of the shallow." Oscar Wilde said it's a curious fact that the worst work is always done with the best intentions, and that people are never so trivial as when they take themselves very seriously. I remember when I was in the service, the toughest job I had was to keep from laughing at the wrong times, during an admiral's inspection, for example. There's nothing funnier than the seriousness of the military, especially high-ranking military. The fancy costumes, the panoply, the shining sabers, the serious faces, it was all to me hilariously funny. As Oscar Wilde said, people are never so trivial as when they take themselves very seriously. We can be serious about situations. When a youngster is ill or hurt, or somebody says the wrong thing to your wife, you can get very serious about the situation in a hurry. But that's not taking ourselves seriously. That's different. The thing that bothered me about Hemingway, as much as I admired his work, and still do, was that I thought he tended to take himself too seriously. He didn't seem to be able to laugh at himself, and I think he suffered. I think his work suffered from this flaw in his character. I found it a good rule of thumb to be slightly suspicious of anyone who takes himself too seriously. There's usually something fishy there someplace. I think this is why we love children so much. Life is a game to them. They'll do their best at whatever work is given them, but they never seem to lose their ebullient sense of humor. There's always a sparkle of humor in their eyes. When a child lacks this, he's usually very sick or in need of help. Dictators are famous for their lack of humor. The mark of the cruel person is that he doesn't seem to be able to see anything funny in the world. And speaking of a sense of humor, this was what was so great about Mark Twain. No matter how serious the subject, he could find the humor in it and bring it out. Will Rogers, too. All the great comedians have this ability to see what's funny in the so-called serious situation. They can poke fun at themselves. And the study of humor is one of the most interesting. What makes people laugh? There are those who believe that a sense of humor is the only thing that has kept the human race from totally extinguishing itself. So keep your sense of humor at all costs. As the man says, you wouldn't be as concerned about what other people think of you if you realized how seldom they do. Lin Yutang, the famous Chinese philosopher, has written, "We don't know a nation until we know its pleasures of life, just as we do not know a man until we know how he spends his leisure. It is when a man ceases to do the things he has to do and does the things he likes to do that the character is revealed. It is when the repressions of society and business are gone, and when the goads of money and fame and ambition are lifted, and a man's spirit wanders where it listeth, that we see the inner man, his real self." Have you ever thought much about that? Your leisure gives you away. I used to know a man who was head of a very large commercial empire. Beginning with nothing but ambition, he became a multimillionaire and finally retired as head of this far-flung company. He bought a large and magnificent yacht with which to cruise the world. And do you know what he did with his free time? He read salacious paperbacks and got falling down drunk and had to be carried to bed unconscious every night. He's dead now. His leisure gave him away. There was nothing there, just nothing at all. He was a one-idea man. Once he was away from that idea, he was a lost child in the wilderness. He didn't enjoy his yacht or travel. Travel meant nothing to him. He was a pitiful, unhappy cipher, not because he was rich. There are thousands, millions just like him in every walk of life. It was just that his millions, which gave him access to the whole world, were worthless to him and accentuated his nothingness. The thing that's always bothered me is how a human being can live for 30 or 40 or 50 years and find no interest, no charm and excitement in the world. Talk about wearing blinders. I guess it has to do with the way a person looks at life. If it's nothing more to him than getting through one day after another as best he can, well, that's one thing. But if he's searching for meaning, well, that's something else. It doesn't mean he'll find it, but the search, the journey itself, can be filled with interest. When FDR first took office as President of the United States, one of his first acts was to visit the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Oliver Wendell Holmes. He was admitted to the old jurist's quarters and found him reading Plato. Justice Holmes was in his 90s. "Why are you reading Plato, Mr. Justice?" the President asked. "To improve my mind, Mr. President," the great judge replied. "To improve my mind." What do you do with your leisure time? It's a good idea to examine carefully this important segment of your life. It exposes the real person, but not the finished person. We can change. We can, like Justice Holmes, still be growing and improving our minds at 92. It doesn't mean we need to read Plato, although it's an excellent idea. But to find fulfillment, meaning, and interest, we need to grow towards something. When we stop growing, like my millionaire friend with the big yacht, we get sick and die. We may stick around a few more years and go through the motions, but for all practical purposes, we really cease to live. We don't know a man until we know how he spends his leisure. It's when a man ceases to do the things he has to do and does the things he likes to do that the character is revealed. It is then we see the inner man, his real self. There's a cute little gal in New York, a public relations executive in her 20s, who has said some interesting things about the so-called youth market. In an editorial in Pace magazine, she wrote, "To me, the youth market just doesn't exist. It's a myth, and I feel myths should be recognized as myths before they infiltrate our thinking. Today, forcefully or passively, we're acting to obliterate historical major myths nurtured here for too long about people, about success, about education, government, sex, lifestyle, personal relationships. Myths impose, they limit. Nothing should ever be imposed except those things that encourage an individual to find out what he or she wants to do and grow toward. A youth market concept limits. A youth market concept is really a nice, neat rationalization for change. It's a nice, neat rationalization for the need for new thinking at all levels. What does exist and is real is an entire population of all ages that's bored and a marketplace that's kind of boring to buy in. But if the pervading youth market concept isn't what necessitates good and imaginative thinking, then what is? Well, I call it, she writes, the avant-garde buyer. A contemporary buyer in a contemporary marketplace. There are no age limits, but a need for quality. An avant-garde buyer is anyone who would enjoy seeing good thinking applied to the marketplace, anyone who wants what's good and imaginative in design, manufacture, function, promotion. Manufacturers, management, advertisers, retailers miss this completely. Their youth-oriented products, promotion and advertising campaigns are usually out of date or not risky enough to appeal. They use methods the avant-garde buyer sees through. Right now there's a plethora of unexciting and look-alike alternatives to choose from, and a lack of exciting, fresh, and imaginative ones. It's not only products that are on the line, but entire company images and policies as well. Avant-garde buyers are literally front-running buyers. Watch them creating needs, obliterating facts and enforcing obsoleteness for the sake of eventually getting what they want. They think things can be made beautifully and to last if they're designed and manufactured well in the first place. They expect those items to be promoted, advertised, and publicized beautifully, simply because the product is valid. If an avant-garde buyer doesn't see what he wants in the marketplace, he'll design and manufacture it himself, not for the sake of ego, but for the sake of getting what he's looking for. And then Patricia Cox writes, I'd rather sew my clothes than buy clothes in any store in Manhattan. They just don't sell what I want, and most of my friends feel this way too. What all this means is the necessity for deep changes in the heads of the people who want dollars and have products to sell to the general market. Forget the myth of the youth market. People who are lured by the so-called youth market run the risk of trying to turn on an entire market that has no artificial age dividers, a contemporary market composed of avant-garde buyers who relish quality. I took my small son and one of his young friends on a 4-day trip to northern Michigan to the cottage of my old friend Bud Irish of Saginaw. Just the two young boys and me to fish and boat on the lake, take long walks, and swim in the crystal clear, clean water on the sandy beach. I'd fix us a big breakfast every morning and provide the sandwiches at midday, and in the evening we'd drive to a nearby village for a big dinner. Most of the time I spent putting worms on tiny hooks and unhooking bluegills and perch and tossing them back into the lake. The boys loved it and gave me time to get away from the city and think. I took along a couple of good books, one of which I'd like to mention now. Beyond the Observatory by the distinguished emeritus professor of astronomy at Harvard University, Harlow Shapley. Much more than a great scientist, he's a humanitarian and philosopher. In his book, he points out that galaxies, a few decades ago, were hazy patches of light concerning which we had only hazy notions or no thoughtful interpretation at all. Now they're recognized as stupendous accumulations of stars, one of which we conceitedly call our galaxy. Man, the so-called crowning glory of creations, is revealed to be peripheral, off-center, in one galaxy among uncounted millions. The whole world of galaxies, now called the meta-galaxy, is expanding in all directions, doubling in size every few hundred years. In the field of cosmography, There are the newly discovered quasars and other queer objects that seem to be millions of times bigger than the stars and a billion times brighter. There's something mysterious here that transcends the present theories about galaxies and their spaces. A fishing trip is a good time to think about such things. As Harlow Shapley put it, it is indeed a grand time to be alive and asking questions. Now that we're reaching toward the stars with manned flight, we're going to be making some very interesting discoveries. I've often thought at how amazed a visitor from outer space might be by the creatures of our Earth. Imagine trying to describe an elephant in a notebook. He'd take a picture of it and write its dimensions along with a comment that while this is the largest land animal, there are creatures swimming in the seas of Earth whose tongues weigh as much as the elephant, as does that of the great blue whale. The more you think of life, from the smallest submicroscopic creatures such as those that live in the intestines of termites, to the largest, to man himself and his frightening and wonderful brain, and see all life on Earth, and Earth itself in its place in one of billions of galaxies, as you think of this and watch two small boys playing in the water, you're filled with awe. You realize that the Pacific Ocean is not even a glistening drop of moisture in the greater creation, that our Earth is only a speck of dust in the whirling winds of time and space. There are, as Dr. Shapley says in his book, scientific discoveries just ahead that will help to revise our knowledge of space, time, and matter. The discoveries could be mind-reeling, stunning. And taking a small boy fishing is a good way to put the world back into perspective. You don't understand any more than you did before, but at least whatever problems you might have had have a way of fading into insignificance. I spoke before the Western Resources Corporation group in Grand Bahamas recently and met a most interesting gentleman. I met many interesting people there, and I found Buzz Arndt, the Vice President and Director of Marketing, particularly interesting. He recommended that I read a book with the ridiculous title, Cloud Hidden, Whereabouts Unknown by Alan Watts, which I promptly ordered and put in my briefcase for reading. It's a good book. I have since also obtained a copy of Alan Watts' autobiography, entitled In My Own Way. Alan Watts died in February '74 after having lived a most interesting life and having written some 20 books. His books are considered the most penetrating and above all readable interpretations of Eastern religions. Although he did not restrict himself to writing about Eastern religions, he created the Zen boom in America and has been popular on college campuses from one end of the country to the other. If you haven't become acquainted with Watts' writings, I think you'll find them interesting and beneficial. I found his discussion of the Chinese Taoism of particular interest. Now, that's spelled Taoism and often mispronounced Taoism. Taoism. The Tao signifies the energy of the universe as a way, a current, a course, or flow which is at once intelligent and spontaneous, but not personal like a Western god. It would be absurd to worship or pray to the Tao because it's your own true self, the very energy and patterning of your bones, muscles, and nerves. Lao Tzu's first statement about it is that it cannot be defined, for the simple reason that you cannot make what is basically you and basically real an object of knowledge. You can't stand aside from it and examine it as something out there. Although then we cannot define it, we must not assume that it is something bleary like the blind energy of 19th century scientists. From our own point of view, our heads themselves are blind spots. But were it otherwise, we should be looking only at neurons and dendrites and would never see mountains and trees. But of course, when neurons and dendrites are seen from the inside, they become mountains and trees. Yet although Tao cannot be examined and pinned down, it has a characteristic atmosphere which may be sensed in the lifestyles of various Far Eastern poets, artists, and sages, and which is indicated by the term Feng Liu in Chinese and Furyu in Japanese, which means something like flowing with or following with the wind. It's also translated as elegance, which is not quite right because in English an elegant person is refined and fussy and perpetrates an atmosphere of haughty disdain. Whereas the Chinese poet is sometimes amiably drunken, wandering aimlessly in the mountains and laughing at falling leaves. One gathers that this sort of person is no longer allowed in China. But he's typified by Putai, the fat, laughing tramp Buddha who carries a gnarled staff and a huge bag of interesting rubbish which he gives away to children. Frederick Spiegelberg, the philosopher and Orientalist, visited a Taoist hermit like Putai on an island near Hong Kong. When he was introduced as an American university professor traveling under a Rockefeller grant to find out whether Asian spirituality was still vital, the hermit began to chuckle very gently, and this gradually developed into uproarious laughter, at which his whole glutinous mass shook like jelly, and that was the end of the interview. A more ancient Taoist sage, whose name I forget, was approached by a Chinese emperor one time to be an advisor to the government. He declined the offer with extreme courtesy, but when the emissary had departed, he washed out his ears, and also those of the donkey on which he customarily rode. Then there was the Chinese Zen priest, famed as a great painter, but who, unlike other priests, grew his hair long. After getting sufficiently drunk, he would dip his hair into a bowl of ink, and then slosh it over a scroll of paper. The next day he'd give himself a Rorschach test on the splosh, and see in it images of mountains, rivers, and forests, which needed only a few touches of the brush to bring them out for all to see. When I was invited to the tea ceremony by the artist and printmaker Saburo Hasegawa, he pointed out the subtle beauty of cigarette ash on a tile made by J.B. Blunk, which we were using for an ashtray. Now, these are vignettes to give you some suggestion of the atmosphere of flowing with the Tao. The principle of the thing is also recognized by our own surf riders, some of whom know very well that their sport is a form of yoga, or Taoist meditation, in which the whole art is to generate immense energy from going with your environment, from the principle of wu-wai, or following the gravity of water, and so making yourself one with it. For as Lao Tzu himself said, gravity is the root of lightness. Now, using this ancient Chinese principle, we learn the senselessness of trying to force our way upstream against the current. Flow with the river. It's another way of saying achieve serenity, or as we say today, or did at least, cool it. Get rid of tension and rigidity. Bend with the wind, and you'll still be around after the hurricane is gone and the good weather returns. It's like the principle of judo, which uses the power and force of your aggressor to defeat him. He makes the move. You simply channel him, using his own force and momentum to easily cause him to sprawl in the dirt. The same thing with the feeling of Taoism. It can be done to trouble, worries, situations which at first seem threatening, but which can, if we flow with the river, be turned to our advantage. A person with such an attitude and philosophy cannot be defeated. He smiles with the wisdom of understanding. He knows that he himself is a part of everything else, the very energy of the universe, and that he can best live and achieve whatever ends he decides upon by going with the wind, with the current, with ease and serenity, never with tension, never with force or strain. In the Western world, we've become used to such terms as the rat race, fighting the competition, getting our share of the market. A world in which tension and strained, concerned expressions are everyday things. We consume tons of tranquilizers to attempt to achieve the very thing that Taoism teaches. In sailing a boat, the force of the wind is used to sail to all points of the compass. With the same wind, we can go north or south, east or west. It all depends upon our attitude, the way we set our sails and proceed. Now, we cannot sail directly into the wind, but we can tack and arrive in good time. Now, we know the maximum speed of a sailboat by a simple formula. It's the square root of the length of the waterline. There's little use in trying to go much faster. If you're cruising in a sailboat, you shouldn't be in a hurry anyway. Alan Watts speaks of the energy of the universe. We can think of the energy of the universe as we think of the wind when sailing. The energy flows. We don't know what it is or where it comes from. We don't need to define it or try to bottle it up. It's there. It's available to us if we're wise enough to use it. We have only to set our course, stay at the helm of our lives, go with the wind and the current, and we'll arrive at our destination in good time, without tension, without worry or strain, or a coronary or an ulcer. What's more exhilarating, for example, than surf riding? Yet we're following the flow of the waves, going with the current, allowing ourselves to be swept along at great speed. Our job is one of skill and balance, learning to manipulate the surfboard. We can learn to sail a boat or ride a surfboard, and we can become expert at whatever we choose to do with our lives. Then we must learn to flow with the current, with the energy of the universe, and it'll bring us anything we seek. It's good to dwell on this ancient Chinese philosophy when driving in traffic, playing golf or tennis, sailing, skiing, selling, working, getting along with our families. It's a good way to go. Flow with the current, ride with the wind. Just keep the skills improving and a steady hand on the wheel and an eye on the sails. Don't push. Don't sweat and strain. Keep your blood pressure down. Move with the traffic. Relax. You'll get there just as fast and without the frayed nerves and dents. Remember, we're not here all that long. Let's enjoy the trip. On a speaking trip to Los Angeles recently, I ran into an old acquaintance, John Hartman, who reminded me of something we should all remain aware of, but which we tend to forget. He said, those of us who travel around the country a lot and get to see the United States from all different perspectives are aware of the tremendous value and potential we have here. We have a truly great product, and we tend to forget it. Well, he's most certainly right. Of all the Western countries, prosperous as they have become, and let's include Japan in the East, not one of them has the resources to be found in such abundant supply in the United States. Canada has the natural resources but lacks the people. Japan has the people but lacks the natural resources. And the countries of Europe, including the British Isles, are greatly dependent upon the rest of the world for their economic survival. We have the land mass, the size we need, a perfect climate for living and producing, enormous natural resources, and the people and the technological skills to do the rest. John was right. A trip around the country with one's eyes open is tremendously rewarding and impressive. It makes you realize that we're just getting started. After reading Cloud Hidden, Whereabouts Unknown by Alan Watts, I ordered some of his other books, and on my recent flying trip to the West Coast, I read his The Wisdom of Insecurity. I think it bogs down some toward the end of the book, but he makes a couple of points in the beginning which make the book an excellent investment. One of them is that security and safety do not exist during our life on Earth. Looking for security or safety is like trying to hold your breath for 10 minutes. It's an impossible quest. But that impossible quest is what keeps so many millions living in a state of strained tension and running as fast as they can from month to month trying to lay hold of a phantom. We are completely secure in the universe. We're as secure in our atomic structure as anything else, a rock or a gas. As the rocket scientist Wernher von Braun has said, as far as living energy is concerned, there can be no death. But during our lives as we know them, the search for security and safety is patently ridiculous. And the best thing we can do in our quest for freedom is to get rid of these myths once and for all. In doing so, we'll know a wonderful new feeling of ease and freedom. It's like taking a deep breath and letting it out with a rush. The other day, a car came speeding through the busy intersection on one corner of which stands the building in which I have my office. He tried to beat the light, failed to do so, and was rammed in the middle of the intersection by a car proceeding on the green. He didn't have his seatbelt fastened, and the jolt of the other car hitting him amidships threw him across the seat to the other side of the car. Then, at high speed, with no one at the wheel, his car rammed into our building, knocking quite a hole in our decorative marble and doing extensive damage to the car. Well, it was fortunate that there were no pedestrians on the sidewalk at that time. Normally, there would have been at that time of day. 3 or 4 people could easily have been killed or seriously maimed. I could have been. There's not a moment of the day or night in which any one of us could not be brought to a sudden end as far as this life is concerned. Therefore, there is no safety. Howard Hughes, hiding in his penthouse, could die of a heart attack or stroke at any time. This fact rules out security and safety. They do not exist on Earth, and the best thing we can do is forget about them and revel in the new freedom, the new release from phony bondage that being concerned about these ancient bugaboos brings about. In our society, the chances are good that any one of us will live a long and normal lifespan. It's the mark of intelligence to plan for such a life and to make every reasonable effort to succeed in the 3 major departments of our lives, in our family lives, in the way in which we spend our days, and to provide for sufficient income to meet our present and future needs. But other than that, we should eliminate all concerns about trying to play it too safely. Now, I like to sail, as I mentioned. When I'm sailing alone, I wear a safety harness at all times. As I move about the boat adjusting the sails, I have my harness snapped to something on the boat so that should I fall or be knocked over the side, I won't find myself treading water and watching my boat sail over the horizon. That's simply good judgment. Accidents and injuries are 60% more likely to the person who doesn't use his automobile seatbelt. Using one is a sign of intelligent judgment, as is locking the doors of our homes when we turn in for the night. The man who ran the red light and rammed our building was a fool, and he's paying for his immaturity. Now, we've all made silly, unnecessary blunders, and we should avoid them whenever possible. To forget about security and safety does not imply the rejection of good judgment. What it does imply is a mature and realistic rejection of factors which, as they are pursued by most of us, simply do not exist. And we move toward freedom when we put them where they belong. I was reminded in Manas that Gandhi proclaimed two values as ultimate, satya and ahimsa, which mean truth and nonviolence. These could be invoked by every individual in every situation. Like the Stoics, he believed that the good man will not live in solitude as a hermit, for he is naturally sociable and active. Virtue is a disposition or capacity of the ruling principle of the soul, assured and unchanging, worthy of choice for its own intrinsic quality, virtue, and its exercise is a continuous activity, that is, never interrupted by lapses and omissions because it can never be lost. The appeal to intrinsic eternal values could be used to reject conservative as well as meliorist creeds that justify the present by appeal to the past or the future, and also the means employed by the distant ends they're supposed to serve. To Gandhi, it is necessary to do what seems to be right in scorn of consequences, and every single act must be justified in terms of the ultimate, unchanging values rather than the results that are expected to emerge. Now, this is excellent advice in the search for maturity and freedom. When problem situations arise, we know intuitively. Our bodies tell us what's right. But in a flash, expediency, or the supposed end toward which we're working, fills our minds, and selfishly we become cowards or willful children when we could have been great. If you'd like to know more about Mohandas Gandhi and his thought in relation to the central religious and philosophical ideas of both East and West, read the book, The Moral and Political Thought of Mahatma Gandhi, by Raghavan Iyer, Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Santa Barbara, California. It's published by the Oxford University Press in New York. It is perhaps particularly apropos that as many people as possible, particularly those who hold or seek political office, read the second chapter, which is titled The Purification of Politics. Gandhi, as Manas points out, is too casually called a politician. He was the most unusual politician in that he believed that the high standards of individual morality ought to have application in politics, and that reason of state could never justify compromise or neglect of moral principles. He saw no distinction, finally, between the good of the individual and the good of society, and while he was not unaware of the slow rate of development of man in the mass, he felt that progress toward a social ideal would be not merely slowed further, but actually prevented by failing to work toward wholly worthy goals. He thought of politics as a practical application of religion, and religion for him lay in religious values rather than in religious beliefs, with the fundamental ethics that he believed to be common with all religions, rather than the formal allegiance to received dogmas that become a barrier to religious experience. Daniel Long, author of the book Of Bombs and Men and Staying Alive, published some years back by McGraw-Hill, once went to Washington with his notebook in his hand to find out when enough is enough. As a model of frustration, his account is unequaled. His question was simplicity itself. Since we already have thousands of nuclear weapons, when will we have enough? Trudging through a maze of government, he asked that question of generals and scientists, diplomats and congressmen. The more people he talked to, the more apparent it became that within the government itself, tentativeness was everywhere. He discovered that nobody would tell him, not because they didn't want to, and not because it was a military secret, but simply because nobody knew. Wandering the capital in search of answers, he grew accustomed to hearing earnest answers that were charged with dilemma and paradox, with fact shaped by opinion, with logic rooted in prayer. To the self-contained world of official Washington, it seemed an unfair question. It was like asking how far is up, to which the only answer is, as far as you want to go. But since nobody was quite sure where we were going, nobody could tell Mr. Lang when we would get there, or indeed if we'd already arrived. Like Diogenes with a notebook, he persisted in his quest with the tenacity of a skilled reporter and the concern of a deeply troubled citizen. Although it produces no solutions, his inquiry into enoughness provides a vivid and troubling portrait of the nuclear confusion we live in. As Ronald Steele wrote in his review of Lang's book, it is one of the paradoxes of our times that the weapons on which our safety presumably depends are designed for the purpose of making their use unnecessary. They are not meant to fight a war which could only result in the destruction of much of Western civilization, if not all of it, but to prevent a war from occurring. The old concept of victory, like a good many other ideas inherited from pre-Hiroshima days, has given way to the concept of deterrence, and in defining what constitutes an adequate deterrent, all is truly dilemma and paradox. The then Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, said that enough equals the amount required to deter an enemy strike, plus the amount needed to minimize damage to this country in the event of a strike. But what will deter an enemy strike? He answered, unacceptable damage from our surviving forces. And what is unacceptable damage? 20 million dead? 50 million? 150 million? Well, here all rational speculation ceases. All we know, or at least all we think we know, is that deterrence means there shall be no aggression without retaliation. But what constitutes an adequate deterrent is anybody's guess. Deterrence is not a science, it's an exercise in political psychology. And the fact that millions of human beings must live this way is, as one official put it, a hell of a way to run a railroad. On her deathbed, Gertrude Stein is said to have asked the question, what is the answer? And a few moments later she answered herself by asking, what is the question? If you've ever had the urge to write, a book that will get you started and perhaps even keep you going is, well, wait a minute. I'll give you the title of the book in a moment. But first, did you ever hear of a man named Frederick Faust? He was probably the most prolific writer who ever lived. During his career as an author, Faust turned out an estimated 30 million words from his typewriter. Now, that's the equivalent of more than 500 average-sized novels. If you've ever done much pecking on a typewriter, you have an idea of what 30 million words are. To give a personal comparison, I've been writing my daily radio program now for more than 14 years. 260 programs a year for more than 14 years. But even so, they total only about 2.25 million words, or the equivalent of about 22 full-size books. But for all his prodigious production, how many people know who Frederick Faust was? A handful. A fairer question would elicit a far greater response. Have you ever heard of Max Brand, one of Faust's many nom de plumes? Under the name of Max Brand, Faust created at least two lasting folk heroes, Destry, as in Destry Rides Again, and Dr. Kildare, plus thousands of other characters. His output was almost unbelievable. During one 13-day period in 1920, he wrote 190,000 words, 3 complete books in 13 days. Now that's a complete book every 4.5 days. He once produced an 8,000-word story in 6.5 hours. When he was working in Hollywood, he used to turn out finished screenplays in a week or two that took most screenwriters several months to complete. In the beginning, this great torrent of Faust prose was poured almost exclusively into the pulp magazines, so-called for their cheap paper and cheap fiction. Faust often had as many as 3 stories in a single issue of a magazine, each story appearing under a different name. Though he wrote mysteries, spy and adventure tales, and historical romances, Faust was primarily known for his westerns, and to one magazine alone, Western Story, which was a favorite of my father's, he contributed 307 stories, serials, and novelettes. Even though he loved to write of the West, he had little use for it as an experience. His publisher once sent him to El Paso, Texas, to soak up some real Western environment, and he spent the whole time in his hotel room reading Greek tragedies, which he read, incidentally, in the original Greek. Even though he later moved up to the higher quality fiction market, the so-called slick, such as Liberty, Collier's, and the Saturday Evening Post, and became as prodigious a supplier to them as he had been to the pulps, he was at heart an intellectual and a classicist. In the early days, while working as a subway laborer and living in a Bowery YMCA in New York, he read Nietzsche, Darwin, Spencer, Kant, Dante, Homer, and the rest in their original languages. His familiarity with the Greek myths was often betrayed by the mythological threads he wove into his Western stories and by the godlike qualities he gave his cowboys. Oddly enough, he failed in his greatest literary attempt. He labored for 6 years on the opus dearest to his heart, an epic poem, Dionysius in the Underworld, only to have it universally rejected by publishers. He finally had to pay for its publication himself. So if you need inspiration to write, get the book Max Brand, The Big Westerner, a biography of Faust by Robert Easton, who calls him an unknown giant and puts him in the company of Fitzgerald, Faulkner, and Hemingway. I read an article by J.B. Priestley in which he pointed out that so much of our lives these days are characterized by the pervasive feeling that there ought to be something else. At the cocktail party, and especially afterwards, on Sunday afternoons and at odd times during our days, we're aware of a small voice telling us that something is missing from our lives. It might be said to be akin to the feeling we sometimes have when something we've wanted to do or a trip we've wanted to take is over, and we're left in the vacuum between events. I think the lack of something else of which Priestley writes might be caused by the lack of an overall journey, which is more important to us than the short trips which go to make it up. If you've ever taken a long motor trip toward a final destination that you want very much to reach, a trip which took several days, you remember enjoying each day's drive. At the end of your driving day, you look forward to stopping for the night, a hot bath, a good dinner after a relaxing drink or two perhaps, then the comfort and satisfaction of a comfortable bed. At that time, all seems well with the world. It's been a good day's drive, but the final destination still lies ahead. There's another day's drive ahead tomorrow. It's the final destination which gives meaning to your days and your efforts, the long hours at the wheel in all sorts of weather and driving conditions. It wouldn't be at all the same if you just drove the same amount of time and distance aimlessly on highways around your home. It would be unbearably boring and frustrating, a terrible waste of time, effort, and fuel. I think the something else is the lack, in so many lives, of a major goal which gleams and beckons in the distance. People often say, young people especially, I want to do something for the world. I want to be of service during my lifetime. It's long been my opinion that the best thing you can do for the world is do the best thing you can do for you. Make out your want list. It's by getting what you most want that you will usually make your greatest contribution to society. We do that which we are motivated to do. The greater the motivation, the more we do. We're motivated most not by what we think we should be doing for the world, but rather by what we most want from the world. You know, Edison didn't invent the electric light for the good of humanity. He invented it because he wanted to more than anything else. That it's been a great boon to man and created one of the world's greatest industries are besides the point. The best preachers are those who enjoy being preachers, and it's the same with teachers, generals, businessmen, and wives and mothers. Those who make the greatest contribution and by so doing reap the greatest rewards are those who thoroughly enjoy what they're doing. The sourest, most miserable and unhappy people on earth are those in fields of service in which they find no deep and abiding joy. They've been punishing themselves for some imagined sin, and they look the part. They often do more harm than good. How many times have you wanted to say to someone, look, friend, if you don't like your work, why don't you quit? But don't take it out on me. So if you have your heart set on doing good for the world and or humanity, get into work for which you're best fitted, work you can thoroughly enjoy and throw yourself into 100%. A happy plumber makes a greater contribution to the world than a miserable university professor or an unhappy lawyer. Some of the world's greatest artists, people who have made tremendous contributions, were neurotic, unhappy people such as Edgar Allan Poe, Vincent van Gogh, Nietzsche, Wagner, and many others. But they had found their outlets. They had found the fields in which they wanted to work, had to work. Surely they would have been even more miserable had they not found their life's work. They would have been insufferable in any other. For some people, there's only one thing for them to do. I can't imagine a Picasso doing anything but drawing and painting pictures. But for most of the rest of us, there are undoubtedly many fields in which we can find deep satisfaction and reward. A fine business executive can be happy in any number of kinds of businesses, and in many different positions. Another man might be just as happy as a carpenter as he would be as an electrician. But when it comes to serving mankind or feeling guilty because you don't think you're doing enough, it's good to remember that we can usually serve the world best by working toward and achieving the goals we want most to reach. Millions of young people in high schools and colleges throughout the world ask themselves, how can I spend my life doing the most good? The best way is to spend your life doing that which you most want to do. In that way, everybody wins. Some time back, I made a talk to about 1,000 university students on the campus of a large, well-known American university. They were wonderfully behaved, laughed in all the right places, and were very receptive to what I had to say, for which I was indeed grateful. I noticed hundreds of them even taking notes. I was worried about that speech. I'd heard so much about the generation gap and reports from young people that anyone over 30 had nothing to say to them that I approached that speech with the trepidation of a man approaching a man-eating tiger with a willow wand. But as I say, it went off fine, and I was very much relieved. And I'm sure one of the things that averted disaster was a comment I used of Scott Buchanan. Scott Buchanan was a great educator who died in 1968, but he'd said, "The powers of the mind are the powers of the man." And building the power of the mind is largely an after-school job. It's a spare-time job. This is why developing the powers of the mind are not necessarily dependent on a formal education. A good liberal education is the best start if you're lucky enough to get one. A good base of English, world history, world literature, and math are fundamental to developing the real powers of the mind, the very subject so many young people dread and work so hard to avoid. If you're interested in this subject, and you'd like to know more about Scott Buchanan and his ideas on education, there's a paperback published by the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in Santa Barbara, California, entitled Embers of the World. It's a series of conversations with Scott Buchanan after it became apparent that he did not have much longer to live. It's a published series of conversations between Scott Buchanan and Harris Wofford Jr., Stringfellow Barr, and others. The powers of the mind are the powers of the man. Once in a talk Buchanan delivered at St. John's College, he asked, "How are you doing? Do you believe in and trust your intellect, that innate power that never sleeps? You've lived a lot. You've fallen into the hands of scholars and into the grooves of practice. You've suffered the winds of doctrine and have gotten lost in the jungle of ideologies. Latterly, you've been stormed by scientific miracle. In all these learnings and practices, have you listened to the small, spontaneous voice within that asks continually, if these things are true? Have you allowed this voice to speak louder and remind you that you do not know, that you know you do not know, that you know what you do not know? Do you believe that knowledge is possible, that truth is attainable, and that it's always your business to seek it, although evidence is overwhelmingly against it? Have you in the course of your life become your own teacher? Have you yet recognized that you are and always have been your own teacher? Liberal education has as its end the free mind, and the free mind must be its own teacher. Intellectual freedom begins when one says with Socrates that he knows nothing, and then goes on to add, "I know what it is that I don't know." The powers of the mind are the powers of the man. Recent studies seem to indicate that the powers of the mind are infinite, rich, fertile land awaiting development. If you can think of something you want that is within the realm of human accomplishment, I can tell you how to get it. To do so, let me tell you a short story about what happened to a friend of mine. My friend is a multimillionaire, tears around the world in his private jet, and in general is keeping busy and having himself a pretty good time. Some years back, he was flat broke and a total failure. He was a failure as a husband, a father, a provider, and had the personality of a polecat. No friends, a complete and thoroughgoing bust. And one day he fell to wondering how people succeed in the world. Well, he had enough nerve to make an appointment with one of his city's most successful men, and during the interview asked him, "How can I succeed?" So the great man asked him what he wanted, and he rattled off a pretty good list of things he wanted, including a nice home, a lot more money than he was making, and so on. Well, many of them were the wrong things, you might say, but at that time of his life he still wasn't very smart. So the great and successful man gave him the secret key to all the abundance he could possibly want. And it was in this short sentence. He said, "People have everything we want. People have everything we want. If all the people in this country gave you a nickel, you'd have $10 million. The people have everything you want. Your part of the bargain is to provide something for the people that they will buy in sufficient numbers to permit you to have what you want. Your part of the bargain is to be worthy of the price you set as your goal. Your job is to grow as a person to fill the shoes of the person you've decided to become. When you set a goal for yourself, you've established a self-fulfilling prophecy. A self-fulfilling prophecy, as S.I. Hayakawa has pointed out, is a statement that is neither true nor false, but is capable of becoming true if it is believed. Reaching your material goals will not mean that you're a nice guy, or that your wife and kids will like you, or that you'll be popular or intelligent or interesting. But you'll have that house and that money and anything else you want that money can buy, and if you're really smart, you'll develop at the same time the things that money cannot buy, things like humility, love of your fellow man, and that includes the wife and kids and the neighbors and so on. But as I said in the beginning, if you can think of something you want that is within the realm of human accomplishment, I can tell you how to get it. First, Decide definitely upon what it is you want. With that fixed in your mind, you must then come up with the plan for providing something from within yourself, your mind and body, that will be valuable enough to people so that they'll give you what you want in return for it. They'll pay you any price. But the requirement remains the same. Your part of the bargain is to fulfill the other part. It's not particularly easy, nor is it particularly difficult. It simply must be done. How are you doing in the idea department? Do you have an idea file, a place to keep your ideas? When's the last time you wrote down a good idea? It doesn't have to be a new idea, you know. Just a little better. Back in the 15th century, there lived a great scholar of the Italian Renaissance. His name was Count Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, and he was brilliant in virtually all fields: logic, ethics, theology, mathematics, Kabbalistic lore, physics. He'd studied Hebrew and Arabic. Like many of the noblemen of his day, he died from poison. It was handed to him by his secretary. There has to be a moral there someplace. But it was about something he wrote that I mention him. He wrote in an essay called The Dignity of Man that a man can choose to be anything. He can partake in, become a part of, anything he wants to. He can become a beast. He can become a god. He can do anything. Now here's writing from the Renaissance, from the 15th century, that could have been written by Sartre, Camus, or yesterday by a modern existentialist. This thought keeps reappearing throughout all of the writings of man. It's a perennial philosophy that runs through most religious thought as well. It states that we become what we choose to become, whether we realize it or not. My son used to love to watch a television program in which contestants would win a prize and then be given the choice of keeping the prize they had won or taking a chance by trading it for a prize that was hidden behind a curtain. The prize behind the curtain might be many times as valuable as the one they had, but then again it might be worthless. Man can choose to be anything, as Pico della Mirandola wrote so long ago, and as the modern existentialists point out, but man all too often doesn't know what he wants to be, or, fearful that the prize behind the curtain might turn out to be a 50-pound bag of garden fertilizer, he holds on to what he has, rather than risk losing it for something of less value to him. Often fearful and not aware of his real powers, living far below his true capacities, he plays for small stakes, not realizing that he holds all the cards. Or, as Huxley once put it, it's like that chess game in which our opponent is perfectly fair and would rather we win, but does insist upon our learning at least the rules of the game. For if we make mistakes, we are checkmated, without haste, but without remorse. When you come to understand something like this, it makes you sit down thoughtfully and ask yourself, what is it I want to become? Or what is it that I want to become next? We can always change course down the road. We're never irrevocably committed. It adds a zest to living, a bit of excitement to getting up in the morning when you know you can pretty well do whatever you want to do. It's sobering, too, when we reflect that if we've been adults for any appreciable length of time, we've made our lives what they are today. And if we're dissatisfied with them, at least it's probably our fault, unless we've been victims of situations over which we could exercise no control. But it's something to think about. A man can choose to be anything, or a woman. He can partake in, become a part of anything he wants to. He can become a beast. He can become a god. He can do anything. Written in the 15th century. There's a famous Italian restaurant in Evanston, Illinois, called Fanny's. It's famous because of its amazing owner, Fanny Lazar, who, in addition to overseeing one of the finest eating places in the country and makes great spaghetti, writes a newspaper column. In one of these columns, she gave some recipes for perpetual youth. Be sure to share this with your wife. She writes, history does not record how many men have searched for the fountain of youth, but centuries before Ponce de Leon there lived in ancient Alexandria a man named Theon, a noted astronomer and mathematician, who with study and research discovered the recipe for perpetual youth. Here it is. A good appetite and a good night's sleep, said Theon, for which nature demands the payment of vigorous physical and deep-breathing exercises, plus bathing in icy cold water every day of one's life. Theon raised his beautiful daughter, Hypatia, with this recipe, and she excelled every woman in Alexandria for sheer physical beauty of body and mind. She was the foremost thinker of her time, a famous Greek philosopher, one of the few female philosophers of all time. She lived from about 370 to 415. Two other great women who learned of Theon's recipe for perpetual youth were Ninon d'Anclos and Catherine, Queen of Russia. They kept their youth until advanced age, Each of them had youthful boyfriends up to and past the age of 80. They indulged in vigorous daily exercise, horseback riding and walking long distances every day of their long lives, and by bathing in icy cold water. How else could they have survived the cold and drafty palaces they lived in? Lena Cavallari, who in her youth was considered the most beautiful woman in the world, believed in daily physical exercise and deep breathing. Every morning she drank 1 tablespoon of pure olive oil to keep her skin from becoming wrinkled. She drank 1 or 2 small glasses of wine with each meal. Then there was Professor Olga B. Lepenshinskaya, who recently died at the age of 92, a biologist who was the Soviet Union's outstanding authority on how to live longer while keeping perpetual youth to old age. She participated in sports, took plenty of long walks, very hot soda baths, 1 cup of soda to a tub, once a week, and drank 1 or 2 vodkas every day. Swedish Sigrid Sampson of Chicago, 77 years young, sparkling-eyed, mentally alert. She looks young because she is young, full of enthusiasm, vim, vigor, and vitality. No stiff joints. She bends, twists, stretches 15 minutes, morning and night. Henry Blackman Sell, prominent in New York society, is an incredible octogenarian who does his own variation of yoga exercises and skips rope every day. He walks 40 blocks to his office daily, and for 25 years his pedometer has registered 40 miles a week. Mrs. Lillian R. Spencer, also of New York City, another octogenarian, is a remarkable youthful elder who attributes her health and vigor to a wholesome diet and sound sleep. Again, she exercises daily, bending and touching the floor 30 times, 3 times a day. She also takes walks and works regular hours in a department store every day. So if you want a good appetite, sound sleep, and beauty for the rest of your life, get plenty of exercise. Get out and walk if you can every day. Keep active. And as for beauty, it seems an ice-cold bath every day does it. That was old Theon's recipe. I'm a hot shower man myself. In his excellent book, Letters for Philip, Dr. Charlie Shedd writes, Dear Phil, there are 3 things I aim to do every day as a husband. 1, tell her I love her. 2, do something nice for her. And 3, pay her a compliment. The truth is that this only sounds simple, but you try these as a regular discipline and you'll see that they say easier than they do, and the toughest of those to remember may be number 3, pay her a compliment. Psychologists tell us that there are several reasons why we restrain ourselves at this point. In some cases, they say the hesitancy comes from a basic hostility syndrome, which means that we're mad at the whole world. People are no darn good, so down with everybody. Or somehow we got the message that since we ought to affect a little embarrassment when we receive compliments, why should we embarrass others by praising them? But I think there may be a more basic reason why many of us husbands are stingy with kind words, and this is because we're people, and the average specimen of the human species is naturally inclined to be selfish. We spend most of our time thinking about number 1. We're too preoccupied with our own emotional feelings. We don't have the time, take the time, or make the time to consider what it would mean to the other person if we opened our faces to say a good word. You can believe me, every woman worth the name is an addict for masculine approval, and the best way to let her know you approve of her is to tell her. There are all kinds of other ways to get the job done, but from the feminine point of view, voicing your likes is one of the nicest. You see, she has many needs, but one of her greatest is to please you. If things are normal at your house, chances are good that she's thinking of you more than you're thinking of her. This is why, if you give her some pleasant things to think about, you're doing a good thing for you and for your future together. The Bible says, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. Well, this also goes for a woman. If you give her a lovely idea of herself, that's what she'll try to become. This is why it makes so much difference what you're telling her. The time finally arrives when she accepts your estimate of her as an estimate of herself. I've seen many an ordinary-looking woman grow into a lovely thing because her husband told her she was lovely. I regret to report that I've also seen some truly gorgeous women gradually fade away because they were no longer inspired from the one source that mattered most to them. All of which leads up to 6 very important words. If you like it, say so. Find something about her to compliment every day. Her voice, her face, her figure, her legs, the slope of her shoulders, the way she walks, her cooking, and the best compliment of all is to tell her, you just go on getting better all the time. A wife will come across town, across the house, across your point of view, and across almost anything, to give you her love if you offer her yours with some honest approval. If you know some young man who's planning to get married, or someone who's already married but hasn't mastered the art, get him the book Letters to Philip by Dr. Charlie Shedd. It's published by Doubleday. The distinguished Harvard professor, author, and researcher into achievement motivation, Dr. David C. McClellan, has posed the question, what accounts for the rise in civilization? Not external resources, that is, markets, minerals, trade routes, or factories, but the entrepreneurial spirit which exploits those resources, a spirit found most often among businessmen. Who is ultimately responsible for the pace of economic growth in poor countries today? Not the economic planners or the politicians, but the executives whose drive or lack of it will determine whether the goals of the planners are fulfilled. Incidentally, if you don't have it, you should get David McClellan's book, The Achieving Society. He says, since I'm an egghead from way back, nothing surprises me more than finding myself rescuing the businessman from the academic trash heap, dusting him off, and trying to give him the intellectual respectability that he's had a hard time maintaining for the last 50 years or so. For the fact is that the businessman has taken a beating, not just from the Marxists, who pictured him as a greedy capitalist, and the social critics who held him responsible for the Great Depression of the 30s, but even from himself, deep in his heart. One of the queerest ironies of history, as John Kenneth Galbraith points out in The Affluent Society, is that in a sense Marx won his case with his sworn enemies, the capitalists. Marx loudly asserted that they were selfish and interested only in profits. In the end, many agreed. They accepted the Marxist materialistic view of history. The modern businessman, says Galbraith, suspects that the moral crusade of reformers, do-gooders, liberal politicians, and public servants, all their noble protestations notwithstanding, are based ultimately on self-interest. What, he inquires, is their gimmick? Well, if not only the Marxists, but Western economists and even businessmen themselves end up assuming that their main motive is self-interest and a quest for profit, it is small wonder that they've had a hard time holding their heads high in recent years. But now the research Dr. McClellan has done has come to the businessman's rescue by showing that everyone has been wrong, that it is not profit per se that makes the businessman tick. Instead, it's a strong desire for achievement, for doing a good job. Profit is simply one measure among several of how well a job's been done, but it's not necessarily the goal itself. The same kind of person who matriculates to leadership in business may be found leading in other fields, too. He's the kind of person who spends his time thinking about doing things better. He has a basic concern for achievement. The secret lies in what a person spends his time thinking and daydreaming about when he is not under pressure to think about anything in particular. What do his thoughts turn to when he's not under pressure? It is not the drive for more and more profits that drives the businessman and is responsible for the rise of civilization. It's the achievement goal, the desire for achievement. Let me draw you a little picture. A housewife sits at her kitchen table. The kids are in school. The husband's at work. Outside it's raining. She sips her tepid coffee and turns the pages of a magazine. In the magazine there's a picture of a striking woman sitting by the pool of her palatial home. The sun is shining. There are flowers and carefully trimmed hedges, and a child is swimming in the pool. Suddenly the housewife stares at her rain-spattered kitchen window and thinks, if I had what she's got, I'd be happy. Happiness. The state of being happy is one of the world's most interesting subjects. It's so interesting because the state of happiness has nothing whatever to do with environment. A world-famous entertainer steps out of his private jet at the Los Angeles airport and is, at that moment, less happy than the man who will now refuel the airplane. Another time, the entertainer will be happier. But the rich woman in the magazine sitting by her pool in the lovely setting is not by any means happier than the woman in the kitchen with the rain coming down outside. Happiness is never a respecter of persons, high or low, queen or charwoman, rich or poor, white, black, or anywhere in between. A friend of mine who's worth several $1 million and who was one of the happiest people I ever knew has changed completely and is now one of the world's unhappiest people. Not because he's a millionaire, but because all the fun's gone out of his life. Happiness is a byproduct of direction. That is, happiness is a condition that depends upon the direction in which we're moving. My friend had been a happy man most of the time for many years because he had been actively working toward a goal he wanted very much to achieve. Well, he's achieved his goal now, with nowhere else to go, which is his own fault, and he's miserable. The world-famous entertainer leaving his private jet is bored and unhappy. He's heading home to a lonely house. The young man servicing the jet plane has a date that night with a girl he's in love with. He's in a state of euphoria. The woman sitting by the pool with a beautiful home may well be quite happy at the time the picture's taken. She's delighted that she and her friends will soon see her and her home in a national publication. While our housewife, her family scattered to work and school, faces the prospect of a lonely day of laundry, cleaning, and cooking, and besides, it's raining outside. If her husband calls and tells her they're going out to dinner with friends that night, she'll be transformed. Or if she learns that good friends or her family are coming to visit that evening or weekend, the work will fly by as she thinks about and plans for the visit. We're happy when we're moving towards something we want to happen, and that's all there is to it. Nothing else makes much difference. The person or family that's working toward goals, priorities that are not too distant to be exciting, will tend to be happier than the person or family without them. Happiness. It's a very interesting thing. Thank you.